Picture yourself standing in a hushed English field in the last cold weeks of April, in the year of our Lord 1066, the soil still hard beneath your feet, the smoke of evening fires curling low over the thatch. You're tired, the way everyone here is tired, from work and worry and the long grey drag of winter, and you tilt your head back to the darkening sky the way people have always done, half in habit, half in hope, and then you see it. Low over the rooftops, brighter than anything has a right to be, a great blazing star with a long streaming tail of pale fire, hanging there as if someone had torn a seam in the heavens and let the light leak through. You do not have a word for it, not really. You call it a hairy star, a fiery besom, a portent, a warning, and for a full week it will not leave. Night after night it burns above the villages of England, and you watch it climb over the same rooftops, and something cold settles in your chest that has nothing to do with the April air. You're looking at what we now call Halley's Comet, though of course you do not know that, because Edmund Halley will not be born for another 600 years and would be rather startled to learn a lump of ice had been named after him. To you, this is simply the sky doing something the sky's not supposed to do, and in the medieval mind, when the heavens break their own rules, someone down below is about to pay for it. Chroniclers up and down the land reach for their quills. The monk Aylmer of Malmesbury, who as a young man had once strapped wings to his arms and thrown himself off the Abbey Tower, surviving, though with 2 broken legs and, one imagines, a lifelong reluctance to discuss the incident, looks up at the comet and is said to have wept, muttering that he had seen this same terror long ago and that it came bearing ruin for his country. He was not, as it turned out, entirely wrong, because that spring England sat on a knife's edge. The old king, Edward the Confessor, had died in January without a clear heir, and Harold Godwinson had taken the crown, and across the narrow sea a duke named William of Normandy was sharpening both his sword and his sense of grievance. When the comet blazed, the whole of England read it as one, enormous cosmic eyebrow raised at their new king, and when, that autumn, Harold fell at the Battle of Hastings with the Norman arrows falling like rain, the story wrote itself. The star had known. The star had warned them. Years later, when the victors stitched their triumph into that astonishing embroidered scroll we call the Bayeux Tapestry, they did not forget the omen. There, worked in wool, you can still see a cluster of little figures craning upward, fingers outstretched toward a strange spoked shape in the sky, and above them the stitched Latin words, Isti mirant stella. These men wonder at the star. Nearly 1,000 years later, they are still wondering, and so, softly, are you. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are settling in, I would love to know where in the world you're drifting off from tonight. So if you feel like it, leave your town and your local time down in the comments, because there is something lovely about knowing we are all watching the same old stars from 100 different windows. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because here is the thing about the world you have just stepped into. To live in medieval Europe was to live inside a book that was constantly being written about you, in a language you were never quite sure you could read. Nothing was only itself. A comet was not a comet. It was a message. A bird was not a bird. It was a messenger. The whole of creation, from the highest star to the smallest sparrow, was thought to be woven through with meaning, a great tapestry of signs stitched by the hand of God. And your job, your daily anxious job, was to notice them before it was too late. That is the real fact worth holding on to tonight. For most people across the medieval centuries, the universe was not silent and indifferent the way we sometimes imagine it now, but chattering, humming, endlessly trying to tell you something, if only you were paying attention. And so you learned to pay attention to everything. If a raven croaked 3 times over the road ahead, you slowed your steps. If a cup was knocked over at supper and the wine ran across the boards, you watched which way it flowed, because even spilled drink might carry a whisper of what was coming. If you sneezed as you crossed the threshold, if a hare crossed your path, if the church candles guttered all at once though no door had opened, you filed it away, quietly, the way you might glance twice at a stranger. Oddly enough, this was not thought of as superstition at all by the people living it. It was closer to common sense, the accumulated wisdom of grandmothers and priests and ploughmen, a kind of folk weather forecasting for the soul. The truly reckless person in this world was the one who ignored the signs. Historians still argue whether the ordinary medieval villager truly believed all of this in their bones, or whether much of it was a comfortable half-belief, worn like an old cloak, something you kept close for warmth and reached for in the dark without ever fully examining the stitching. And that, in a way, is exactly where we're going tonight. Over the hours ahead, at whatever gentle pace your eyelids allow, we are going to wander together through that signed and whispering world. We will read the sky for comets and eclipses and blood-red moons. We will consult the birds, the beasts of the bestiaries, the glittering stones of the lapidaries that were thought to ward off poison and sorrow. We will sit in on the quiet dread of unlucky days and the small magic of thresholds and hearths and holy wells. There is no need to hurry, and no need to stay awake for all of it, because the star, unlike your new king, is in no rush at all. So let your shoulders drop, let the fan hum on, and let us begin where these people always began, by looking up. And so, as the last of those distant bells fades into the dark, let your thoughts drift a little wider, up and out from the single village, to the whole shape of the world as a medieval person understood it, because to make any sense of why they read omens in everything, you first have to stand inside their sky. Picture it not as empty space, but as a vast ordered household, every room stacked neatly above the last, every creature and stone and star with its assigned place and its assigned duty. The cosmos you're drifting through tonight is not indifferent. It is watchful. It is, in a very real sense, always trying to tell you something, and the medieval mind assumed the polite thing to do was to listen. At the centre of it all sat a god who was believed to speak constantly, not only through scripture and the murmured Latin of the Mass, but through the created world itself, through weather and birds and the turning of the seasons. This is the deep idea beneath everything you will encounter on this journey. The notion of a providential universe, a world in which nothing is truly random and every event, however small, might carry a message from a higher hand. A comet was not merely a comet. A two-headed calf was not merely an unlucky Tuesday for a farmer. These were signs, and a sign by definition points at something. The trick, of course, was working out what, and here the medieval world showed a truly heroic willingness to guess. Layered over the older mossy foundations of folk belief, this Christian cosmos did not so much replace the pagan past as move in on top of it and rearrange the furniture. The parish priest blessed the fields, yes, but the fields had been blessed in other ways long before he arrived, and the two traditions settled into an uneasy shared tenancy that lasted for centuries. You will find, again and again on this walk, a Christianity of the villages that kept one hand on the altar and the other quietly tucked into an older, greener kind of custom, and mostly nobody minded so long as the harvest came in. To organise this crowded, talkative universe, medieval thinkers reached for two beautiful ideas. The first was the correspondence between the macrocosm and the microcosm, the grand old principle sometimes softened into the phrases above, so below. The great world, the cosmos with its wheeling planets and its fixed stars, was believed to be mirrored in the little world of the human body. The same forces that moved the heavens were thought to move your blood, your moods, your dreams, which meant rather conveniently that a careful reading of the sky could double as a reading of the self, and a great many people found this idea irresistible, then and honestly now. The second great idea was the great chain of being, that towering ladder of existence running from God at the top, down through the ranks of angels, then kings and bishops, then ordinary men and women, then the beasts, the plants, and at last the plain silent stones. Everything had its rung. Everything had its neighbour above and below. It was, when you think about it, the most rigidly organised filing cabinet ever imagined, and its great comfort was that it left absolutely nothing out and absolutely nothing free to wander. If the whole of reality is one unbroken chain, then a tremor at one end can be felt at the other, and a strange event in the sky might reasonably rattle the affairs of men. Now the Church, it must be said, had a complicated relationship with all this wonder. On the one hand, it positively encouraged awe at the signs of creation, teaching that the world was a book written by God, a thing to be read with reverence. On the other hand, it drew a hard, nervous line at what it called superstitio, the improper reading of signs, the reaching past God to bargain with lesser powers. And here we meet one of the towering warriors of the tradition, St. Augustine of Hippo, who in his City of God and his Handbook on Christian teaching set himself firmly against divination and the casting of horoscopes, arguing that to trust the stars over the will of God was to hand your soul to demons dressed up as astronomy. Augustine's suspicion echoed down the centuries like a stern cough in a quiet church, and yet the appetite for meaning never faded, which brings us to a genuine, well-documented fact worth holding on to as you settle deeper into your pillow. In the early 7th century, a Spanish bishop named Isidore of Seville compiled an enormous encyclopedia called the Etymologies, a sprawling attempt to gather all human knowledge into one place, and it became one of the most copied and beloved books of the entire Middle Ages, a fixture of monastic libraries for the better part of 1,000 years. Isidore catalogued the heavens, the winds, the beasts, the stones, and the meanings of words, and in doing so he helped teach generation after generation to see the natural world as a dense forest of significance. Every creature a little sermon, every stone a lesson. Historians still argue whether ordinary villagers truly separated their Christian faith from their inherited omen lore in their own minds, or whether the two simply melted together into one seamless way of walking through a meaningful world. What's clear is that the reading never stopped. Astrology mapped your fate in the planets. The weather carried warnings, a red sky, a ring around the moon, a restless wind. Dreams were letters from beyond to be turned over and interpreted at dawn, and even the smallest domestic disaster could be freighted with meaning, which is where the strange part comes in, because oddly enough, medieval dream books and omen lists treated a spilled salt cellar or a stumble on the threshold with the same grave attention they gave to eclipses, as though the universe were forever leaving you passive-aggressive little notes. So this is the mind you are borrowing tonight. A mind for which the world was crowded, ordered, and endlessly expressive. A place where God spoke in comets, and the great chain hummed from the throne of heaven down to the pebble under your boot, and where, if you only knew how to read them, the signs were always gently everywhere. And so, with the hush of that shuttered sick room still soft behind you, you drift out again beneath the open medieval night, where the stars sit fixed and familiar and reassuringly obedient, until, on some cold evening, one of them refuses to behave. You tilt your head back, and there it is, a smear of pale fire hanging over the rooftops, trailing a long, luminous tail like combed silver, and every soul in the village has stopped whatever they were doing to stare up at it, with the particular expression of people who suspect the universe has just cleared its throat to make an announcement. They called it a hairy star. That is not a bit of whimsy on your narrator's part. It is the honest translation. The Latin was Stella Comata, or Stella Crinita, the long-haired star, the tressed star, borrowed straight from the Greek comets, the one wearing long hair, which is also where your modern word comet quietly comes from. To the medieval eye, that streaming tail really did look like loosened hair, or a beard, or a banner of flame unfurled across the dark, and unlike the steady wheeling constellations, it arrived without warning, sat where no star had any business sitting, and then, after a few unnerving weeks, packed up and vanished. A star that comes and goes and grows hair is, you must admit, exactly the sort of thing you would rather not see on your way to bed. Because to the people beneath it, a comet was never merely pretty. It was a blazing sign, a portent, a warning scrawled across heaven in fire, and the message was almost always bad. War, famine, plague, the fall of a city, above all, the death of a king. Chroniclers across Europe recorded these apparitions with the grim diligence of accountants tallying debts, and again a hairy star would be dutifully noted in the margin, followed a year or two later by some catastrophe, and the monk with the quill would nod knowingly, as if the two had shaken hands. Rarely did anyone record the comets that were followed by nothing much happening at all, which is, when you think about it, a marvellously convenient way to keep your prophecies undefeated. Here is your one solid, well-lit fact to carry into sleep. The comet that blazed over Europe in the spring of 1066 was the same object we now call Halley's Comet, and it hung in the sky for weeks just before Duke William of Normandy crossed the sea and took England at Hastings. The embroiderers of the Bayeux tapestry stitched it in above the head of the newly crowned King Harold, a fiery star with a fringed tail, and beside it they sewed the words Isti Mirant Stella. These men marvel at the star, and marvel they did, because in the very next scene, poor Harold is shown slumping uneasily on his throne while ghostly ships gather in the border below him, as though the tapestry itself is leaning in to whisper, "You saw the sign, mate." You can hardly say you weren't warned. There is a lovely, half-legendary figure attached to that same comet, and here is the strange part. At Malmesbury Abbey there lived an elderly monk named Aylmer, famous in his own right for once strapping wings to his arms and leaping from the abbey tower. He glided a fair distance, broke both legs on landing, and spent the rest of his life insisting he'd have managed beautifully if only he'd remembered to fit a tail. When Aylmer saw the comet of 1066, the old man is said to have shuddered and cried out to it as though greeting an unwelcome acquaintance. "You have come, have you? You come? bringing grief to many a mother. For Aylmer claimed to have seen this very same star once before, decades earlier as a boy, and remembered the sorrow that followed. Oddly enough, he was right about it being the same star. It returns roughly every 76 years, though nobody would understand the clockwork of that, until Edmund Halley worked it out more than 6 centuries later. The Church, meanwhile, had a rather more delicate relationship with these blazing signs, because there was, after all, one very famous star in the Christian story that had been thoroughly good news, and this is where a painter enters your night. When Halley's comet swung past again in the autumn of 1301, a young Florentine named Giotto di Bondone almost certainly stood beneath it and looked up, just as you're looking up now. And a few years later, painting the Adoration of the Magi on the walls of the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua, he set above the stable not a tidy twinkling point of light, but a great fiery comet streaming its tail down toward the newborn child. It is the Star of Bethlehem reimagined as the hairy star he had seen with his own eyes, and it may be the first time in Western art that a comet was painted from life rather than imagination. Historians still argue whether Giotto truly witnessed the 1301 apparition himself, or simply worked from the awestruck accounts of those who had, but the tale in that fresco has convinced enough people that when the European Space Agency sent a probe to fly through Halley's comet in 1986, they named the little spacecraft Giotto in his honour. Now why should a smear of light so reliably mean doom? The learned answer of the age came, as so much did, from Aristotle by way of a great many patient copyists. A comet, they explained, was not a heavenly body at all, but an exhalation, a hot, dry vapour drawn up from the earth into the highest reaches of the air, where it caught fire and hung there smouldering. And a burning cloud of corrupted vapour hovering over the world could only sicken the air beneath it, breathing pestilence down onto the fields and towns, poisoning the very breeze that dried the washing. So the comet did not merely announce the plague. In the medieval imagination it helped to brew it, exhaling corruption like a slow bad breath across the kingdom. Small wonder the sight of one sent people hurrying indoors to bolt the shutters, as if a wooden latch might reason with the sky. And so you pull your own cloak a little closer, and watch the hairy star lean westward over the sleeping thatch, patient and bright and in absolutely no hurry to explain itself. And so, with the comet still fading behind your eyes, you lift your gaze a little higher, past the trailing stars, to the 2 great lamps of the medieval sky, the sun and the moon, because nothing at all unsettled the people around you quite, like the moment one of those lamps went dark. You have to remember that in this world the sun is not a ball of burning gas some 93 million miles away. It is the steady, dependable eye of heaven, the one thing that rises without fail, the great clock of ploughing and prayer and pottage, and the moon is its softer sister, marking out fasts and feasts and the quiet business of the fields. So when either of them dims, blackens, or turns the colour of old wine, the whole ordered cosmos seems to hold its breath, and so quietly do you. Picture it. A perfectly ordinary morning, the market half awake, a dog asleep in the warm dust, and then the light begins to fail, not with the soft grey of a gathering storm, but wrongly, coldly, from a clear and cloudless sky. The birds, confused, go to roost in the middle of the day. The temperature drops. A strange bruised twilight settles over the fields, and along the darkening edge of the sun a ring of pale fire trembles like something not meant for human eyes. To you, standing there, this is not a delightful astronomical curiosity to be watched through a bit of smoked glass. This is the sun being devoured. This is God, quite possibly, clearing his throat. The learned had a word for it. Eclipses, a borrowing from the Greek for abandonment or failing, which is a rather on-the-nose name for the sun apparently deciding to knock off early. And across the chronicles the reading is remarkably consistent. An eclipse is anger made visible, a warning etched across the heavens, and above all a portent for the great and the powerful. Ordinary folk might sicken and die by the thousand without the sky so much as flickering, but let a king be marked for death and suddenly the sun itself must pull a black hood over its face. Here is a real and well-attested fact for you to carry down towards sleep. On the 2nd of August in the year 1133, a total solar eclipse swept across England and Europe, and after King Henry I died a little over 2 years later, chroniclers looked back and knit the 2 events together so firmly that the darkness became known as the King's Eclipse, a doom that had been hanging in the air all along. That the eclipse actually came more than 2 years early was apparently a detail nobody wished to dwell on. And this is the gentle comedy that runs all through the medieval reading of the skies, The omen is almost always spotted afterwards, once you already know how the story ends. The sun darkens, the harvest is fine, the king is well, everyone forgets. The sun darkens, a bishop stubs his toe 18 months later. Behold, the sign was clear to all. Historians still argue whether the monks who recorded these eclipses genuinely believed in their prophetic power, or simply found them irresistibly convenient bookmarks for disaster, a way of giving shape and meaning to a chaotic age. What is certain is that the chroniclers noted them with enormous care. In the monastery, where the day was already carved into tidy hours by the ringing of bells, an eclipse was an event worth its ink. And time and again you find them entered in the annals cheek by jowl with famines, floods, the deaths of great men, and the occasional two-headed calf, all filed together under the broad and busy heading of signs. Then there is the moon, and her own particular horror, the blood on the moon. When the earth slides between the sun and its pale sister, the moon does not simply vanish. She turns slowly, a deep and smouldering copper red, as though someone had dipped her in wine, or worse. To an age steeped in scripture, this was language everyone understood, for the prophet Joel had promised that the sun would be turned to darkness, and the moon to blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord, and here was that very moon, hanging red and swollen over the thatch, apparently keeping the appointment. Small wonder that a red moon set nerves jangling from the alehouse to the abbey. And here is the strange part, the quirky little thread worth tucking away. That same eerie red glow which terrified your medieval neighbour is caused by nothing more sinister than the light of every sunrise and sunset on Earth, bent through our atmosphere and painted gently across the moon's face all at once. So the blood is really the whole world's dawn reflected back at you. Now, it would be far too easy and far too unkind to imagine your medieval companions as simple souls cowering under every shadow. The truth is more interesting. All the while, in quiet rooms lit by tallow candles, scholars were doing genuine astronomy, poring over Ptolemy, over Arabic star tables carried west through Spain, learning to predict eclipses years in advance with real and growing precision. A well-read monk of the 12th century could often tell you, to the day, when the sun would fail. And yet, this is the tender human part. Knowing exactly when the darkness would come did remarkably little to soften the dread of it when it actually arrived. You can hold the mathematics of the heavens in one hand and still feel the old cold prickle at the back of your neck when the daylight drains away and the birds fall silent. The head may have understood the mechanism. The heart, standing in that unnatural dusk, still whispered that something enormous was passing overhead. So you stand there a moment longer in that copper-tinted hush, the fields gone still, the red moon watching, half a world away from the comets, and yet not so far at all, for the medieval sky was one great parchment, and every mark upon it, bright or dark, was thought to be a word in a very long and very serious letter, addressed, always, to those with the wit and the fear to read it. And so, as the hush of the fields gives way to the rustle of wings above you, let your eyes drift upward, because the medieval sky was never merely a sky. It was a page, and the birds were the letters written across it. To walk beneath that sky was to be forever half reading it, and no birds were read more anxiously than the dark ones. When a raven settled on a gable or a crow wheeled 3 times over a rooftop, a whole household could go quiet. These were the carrion birds, the ones that gathered where death had already done its work, and everyone who had ever passed a battlefield knew exactly what a raven's patience meant. The birds followed armies the way gulls follow a plough, and so, to the medieval eye, to see them circling was to see the future leaning down to whisper that someone, somewhere, would soon be food for them. Cheerful company, the raven, the sort of guest who arrives before the funeral and somehow knows the way. The old northern stories only deepened the dread, for the raven had once belonged to Odin himself, who kept 2 of them, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, and sent them out across the world each dawn to bring him back its secrets. A bird that carried the knowledge of a god was not a bird you wanted lingering at your window, and long after the north had turned to the white Christ, that shiver remained. Chroniclers noted ravens croaking before sieges, before the deaths of kings, before plagues. And here is the strange part, the very intelligence that unsettled people. The way ravens seem to watch you, to remember faces, to wait, is precisely what naturalists prize in them today. So the medieval instinct that these birds were uncannily knowing was, in its own crooked way, not entirely wrong. The magpie, that handsome black and white cousin, carried a lighter dread, though a persistent one. You may already know the little counting rhyme that grew up around it. 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, 4 for a boy, a verse recited whenever magpies were spotted. The birds tallied like coins to reckon your luck for the day. Historians still argue whether that familiar rhyme is genuinely medieval or a tidier invention of later centuries dressed up in old clothes, since the version we sing was only written down well after the Middle Ages had closed. But the unease beneath it is old indeed, and a lone magpie was long thought a herald of sorrow. People took to greeting the single bird politely, a nod, a tip of the cap, a murmured, "Good morning, Mr. Magpie," on the sensible theory that it never hurts to be courteous to something that might be an omen. Being polite to a bird in case it curses you is, when you think about it, one of the more forgiving forms of superstition. Nobody ever got hurt saying good morning. Then there was the owl, and the owl was almost always bad news. Its cry came out of the dark when honest folk were abed, and that alone was enough to damn it, for the medieval night belonged to the dead, the damned, and things best not named. To hear an owl hoot near a house where someone lay ill was to hear, many believed, the summons itself, the soul being called away on soft grey wings. The Romans had felt this too, and the naturalist Pliny had written of the owl as a funereal creature, a bird of ill omen haunting deserts and darkness, and that ancient dread flowed straight down into the medieval bones of Europe. The owl became the emblem of the sleeper who wakes to sorrow, and to see one abroad in daylight was worse still an unnatural thing. Not every bird brought a chill, mind you. The robin, that small-breasted flame flitting about the winter garden, was tenderly regarded, wrapped in a Christian legend that its red breast was scorched when it plucked a thorn from Christ's brow, or fanned the embers of a dying stove to warm the infant in the manger. To harm a robin was thought to bring misfortune raining down on your own head, and country folk would sooner go hungry than trouble one. So the robin got the good press, and here is a real fact worth tucking under your pillow. That gentle regard has outlived the Middle Ages almost entirely intact, which is why, centuries later, the robin still perches on Christmas cards as though it never left the manger at all. Softer still in memory is the chough, the glossy black bird with a bright red bill and legs found along the cliffs of Cornwall. For the Cornish held that the soul of King Arthur himself had passed at his death not into the grave but into a chough, the red of its beak and feet being the blood of that last dreadful battle. So long as the choughs cried along the sea cliffs, Arthur was not truly gone, only sleeping, as the once and future king was always said to be doing somewhere just out of sight. But the omen that emptied the colour from every medieval face was simpler and closer to home. A bird that flew in at an open window or beat its wings against the glass or tapped, at the pane after dark, was widely held to be announcing a death in that house, and no reassurance from the priest could quite scrub the fear away. The soul, people felt, sometimes wore feathers, and a bird come indoors had come to fetch one. Oddly enough, sparrows and swallows and wrens nesting under the eaves were welcomed as luck, so it was not the bird itself, but the crossing of the threshold, the entering in, that turned a blessing into a warning. All of this, of course, the church officially frowned upon, for reading the future in birds was augury, and augury was very old, older than Rome, whose priests, the augurs, once took the auspices by watching the flight and feeding of birds before any great decision. The very words we still use, auspicious and auspices, come from that bird-watching, from the Latin for one who observes the birds. Churchmen thundered against it, an 8th century list of forbidden practices, the indiculus superstitionum, set down de augurii, divination by birds, among the pagan errors to be stamped out. And yet, for all the sermons, folk went on tipping their caps to magpies and shuddering at owls, because a warning that costs nothing to heed is a warning most people will keep. So as the last owl calls somewhere beyond the trees, let it call, and let it pass, and drift on beneath that written sky toward what comes next. And so you drift on from the crooked signs of the sky and the weather, down out of the clouds and back to the warm, breathing, four-footed world that shared the medieval night with you, because if the heavens could whisper omens, then surely, people reasoned, the creatures underfoot could whisper them too. You settle now by a low hearth where a cat lies curled like a comma of shadow, and you watch the firelight move in its half-closed eyes, and you begin to understand that this small purring thing carried on its back one of the strangest reputations of the entire Middle Ages. The cat, you see, was a creature caught between two worlds. By day it was useful, even beloved, the barn cat that kept the granary free of mice, the abbey cat allowed to doze among nuns, the quiet companion permitted even to holy women who were otherwise told to own almost nothing. but by night, in the imagination of the fearful, that same soft animal became something else entirely, especially if its fur was black and its eyes caught the candle just so. There is a real and rather dark document behind this, and it is worth telling carefully, because the truth is stranger and more modest than the legend. In the year 1233, Pope Gregory IX issued a decretal known as the Vox in Rama, sent to churchmen and princes in Germany, among them the fierce inquisitor Conrad von Marburg, and in it he described the alleged secret rites of a heretical sect. Among the lurid details was a black cat that supposedly descended among the worshippers, walking backward with its tail held high, and the initiates were said to bow and give it a reverent kiss in a place no cat has ever objected to being kissed. That is what the document actually says. What it does not say, and this matters, is that all cats are demons, or that anyone should go out and harm them. And here is the part the internet loves to get wrong, so let us be gentle and precise. For a long time, people repeated a tidy little story that this papal letter launched a continent-wide massacre of cats, which in turn let the rats multiply, which in turn brought the Black Death. A very satisfying chain of dominoes that makes the medieval church the villain and the cat the tragic hero. Historians still argue whether the Vox in Rama had any measurable effect on how ordinary people treated their cats at all, and the honest answer leans toward very little, because there is simply no archaeological or documentary evidence of any organised cat culling in the 13th century, and the great cat panics that did happen came later, well after the medieval world had turned its worried eye elsewhere. The cat's reputation curdled slowly over centuries, not in a single afternoon by papal command. Then there is the delicious tangle of the Cathars, the dualist heretics of southern France, whose very name some medieval writers cheerfully, and quite wrongly, claimed came from the Latin word for cat, insisting the heretics were so called because they supposedly kissed a cat during their gatherings. It was clever, insulting, and almost certainly a bit of invented wordplay by their enemies rather than sober etymology, the medieval equivalent of a bad pun weaponized into an accusation. You can almost picture some earnest churchman leaning back, delighted with himself, thinking he had cracked a great mystery, when really he had only made a joke that outlived him by 800 years. But the cat was not alone in its suspicious little club. Out past the hedgerow in the grey hush before dawn ran the hare, and the hare, people whispered, was very often not a hare at all. All across the folklore of the medieval and early modern countryside there lingered the belief that a witch could slip out of her own skin and go, loping over the fields in the shape of a brown hare, which is why a hare that crossed your path or lingered too long by the door was regarded with real unease. There were even hushed cures for it. The idea that a hare witch could only be wounded by silver, so that a farmer who found a limping old woman the morning after a hare escaped his dogs felt he had solved something. It is, when you think about it, a remarkably inconvenient superstition, because it means every perfectly innocent rabbit dinner came with a faint whiff of accusation, a joke the hares themselves, I suspect, did not find funny in the slightest, and when the light failed entirely and the household drew close to the coals, the ears turned to the dogs. A dog howling in the deep of the night, especially outside the window of the sick, was widely taken as a death omen, a creature sensing the approach of something the living could not yet perceive. This belief that animals could feel death and evil before people could was everywhere. The horse that balked at a haunted crossroads, the cattle that knelt on Christmas Eve, the cat that would not enter a cursed room. Here is the quirky little tidbit worth tucking under your pillow. Medieval lapidaries, those solemn catalogues of magical stones, insisted that a gem called the toadstone, or buffonite, grew inside the head of an old toad and could detect poison by growing warm against the skin, and physicians and lords genuinely wore these toadstones set in rings, though the stones were in truth the fossilized teeth of an ancient fish and had never been anywhere near a toad's head at all. The toad itself, squat and cold-eyed in the damp corners of the garden, was thought to brim with hidden power, a favoured companion of witches, a vessel of venom and secret virtue, and yet, in the same breath, a source of healing charms. It was that whole tender contradiction of the medieval mind laid bare in one warty little animal. The same creature could be feared and farmed, cursed and carried in a pocket for luck, all at once. And as your own eyes grow heavy in the firelight, the cat by the hearth stretches, yawns, and settles again, utterly indifferent to the centuries of suspicion it has slept through, as cats always have. And so, as the lane narrows and the shutters lean closer overhead, you begin to notice how carefully people look at one another here. Or rather, how carefully they avoid looking too long, too warmly, too admiringly. Because in this world, a glance is not a harmless thing. A glance can carry weight. A glance can carry poison. You have wandered, without quite realizing it, into the long shadow of the evil eye. And it is one of the oldest fears you will meet on this whole slow journey. Older than the cathedrals, older than the kingdoms, older than nearly everything except the fear of the dark itself. The learned called it fascinatio, and the amulet against it fascinum, and yes, this is the very same root that gives you the word fascinate. So the next time something absolutely captivates you, remember that you are, etymologically speaking, being mildly cursed. The idea was simple and terrible. A person who looked upon you with envy, with covetousness, with that hot little pinch of resentment at your good fortune could, through the eye alone, without a word, without a touch, reach out and wither what they saw. A healthy child could sicken. A milk-heavy cow could go dry overnight. A fat harvest could rot in the barn. The eye was a kind of leak, a channel through which envy seeped out and settled on whatever it admired. And the more admirable the thing, the more dangerous the looking. This was not some fringe village muttering either. Here is the plainly stated fact. The belief in the evil eye is genuinely ancient and was taken perfectly seriously by educated Romans centuries before your medieval night ever fell. Pliny the Elder, writing his vast natural history in the 1st century, records with a straight face that certain people and even certain whole tribes could bewitch, with a look, and were especially deadly when they praised, and he notes the common Roman habit of spitting to fend off such enchantment. Spitting, a small, damp, deeply unglamorous defence that follows the evil eye clean through antiquity and into the Middle Ages, where a grandmother might spit 3 times, softly, at the sight of a beautiful baby, not out of rudeness but out of love, which is surely the most affectionate insult ever devised, because that is the strange knot at the heart of it all. The danger was not hatred. The danger was admiration. To say aloud that a baby was plump and rosy, that a bride was lovely, that an ox was the finest in the district, was to hang a little lantern on that thing in the dark and invite every envious eye in the parish to find it. And so praise itself became perilous, and had to be diffused the instant it was spoken. You would hear a mother's whole body tense when a stranger cooed over her infant, and you would hear the ritual antidote follow at once, a muttered blessing, a God keep him, a touch of wood, a spit, a horn-shaped charm pressed quickly into the child's swaddling. The compliment and the counter-charm arrived together, like a knock and an answer, and oh, the charms. You will see them everywhere once you know to look. There is the manofica, the fig hand, a fist with the thumb poked out between the first 2 fingers, a rude little gesture with a very long pedigree, worn as a tiny amulet of coral or bone or jet and dangled from a baby's neck or a horse's harness. There is the mano cornuta, the horns, index and little finger thrown up while the middle fingers fold down, the same sign your modern rock concert still throws to the sky with absolutely no idea it began as armour against a jealous stare. There is red thread, red ribbon, a red bead knotted at a wrist or braided into a mare's tail, because red was the colour that caught and held the malignant glance before. It could reach the tender thing beneath. And above all there is coral, that strange red branch dredged from the sea, which the lapidaries and bestiaries praised as a guard for children specifically. A sprig of red coral hung at a baby's throat was thought to pale and darken as it drew off harm, a little sentry that took the blow so the child would not. Historians still argue whether these charms were understood as genuine machinery, objects that physically caught and absorbed the eye's poison, or whether most people wore them the way you might carry an umbrella on a grey morning, more habit and comfort than firm conviction. And the honest answer is that the medieval mind rarely bothered to draw the line you would want it to draw. And here is the quirky part, oddly enough. The very shapes chosen to repel the eye were shapes designed to snag it. The horn, the fist, the bright red bead, the little grotesque face, all of them were meant to be seen first, to be gaudy and startling and slightly absurd, so that the covetous glance would strike the ridiculous charm, and spend its venom there instead of on the child. The whole theory of protection was essentially giving envy something shinier to look at, which is either profound folk psychology or the world's oldest decoy, and possibly both. Now, you might expect the church to have swept all of this away as pagan nonsense, and it certainly tried now and then from the pulpit. But the fear was far too useful and far too deep to simply forbid. So instead the church did what it so often did. It absorbed the thing, baptized it, and quietly renamed the parts. The spit and the horns did not vanish. They were joined by the sign of the cross drawn over the cradle, by holy water flicked at the byre door, by the murmured "God bless," that to this day trails after every compliment out of sheer inherited reflex. Envy became one of the 7 deadly sins, and the evil eye slid neatly into that older frame, so that the covetous glance was now not merely dangerous but sinful, a small leak of the soul's worst appetite. The bell in the tower ahead tolls once softly over the sleeping roofs, and you press on, keeping your own eyes, you notice, politely, prudently lowered. And so you drift from the hearth toward the long table, where the candles have burned low and the last of the evening meal still lingers in the air, and here, resting near the centre of the board in a little vessel of pewter or silver, you find something the medieval household treats with a reverence that might, at first, seem almost comical to you: a small heap of salt. Just salt. The same plain white grit you might scatter without a second thought, and yet in this world it is precious, sacred, half magical, worth guarding and blessing and worrying over, because salt does not spoil, salt preserves, salt keeps meat sweet through the long, dark months when nothing grows, and a thing that defies rot and decay so quietly is a thing that feels, to the medieval mind, touched by something eternal. Salt is incorruptible, and in a world obsessed with corruption of every kind, that makes it holy. You can hear this holiness in the church itself, for the priest who baptizes an infant will sometimes place a few grains of blessed salt upon the child's tongue. An old rite of salt as a sign of wisdom and preservation, a small savour of incorruption pressed into a new soul before the water even touches its brow. And here is a real thread of history for you to hold in the hush. The medieval church kept a formula for blessed salt, sal benedictus, exorcised and consecrated and then mingled into holy water, so that the very water sprinkled over. Thresholds and sickbeds and freshly dug graves carried salt within it. Salt in the font, salt in the holy water, salt tucked into the corners of a house against whatever might creep in after dark. The substance is understood as something the devil simply cannot abide, a seasoning of the sacred that sours every dish the enemy might hope to serve, which is why, of course, everyone at this table has gone slightly pale, because someone has just knocked the salt over. A sleeve, a careless elbow, a reaching hand, and the little white heap has tumbled across the wood, and for one breath the whole company falls quiet, as though a small bell of doom has rung. Spilled salt is an ill omen, a waste of the incorruptible, an insult to the sacred, and, worse, an open invitation. For where holiness has been scattered and squandered, the devil is thought to lean in close, and everyone knows precisely where he likes to stand. He waits at your left shoulder, the sinister side, the unlucky side, hovering just behind you in the dark where you cannot quite turn to catch him. So the remedy is swift and small and strangely tender. You take a pinch of the spilled salt between your fingers and toss it back over your left shoulder, straight into the devil's watching eyes to blind him and send him grumbling off before he can make any mischief of your clumsiness. It is, when you think about it, a wonderfully practical bit of theology. A full spiritual counterattack that costs roughly 3 grains of salt and a flick of the wrist. Now, oddly enough, the spilling itself was often read as the true warning, and the throwing merely as the cure. And the strange part is how neatly the gesture survives even now, centuries later, in kitchens where nobody remembers there is supposed to be a devil back there at all. People still fling that pinch over the shoulder out of some inherited flinch, guarding against a fiend they have entirely forgotten to believe in, which may be the most medieval thing about the modern dinner table. But salt does more than fend off the enemy. It also, quietly and mercilessly, tells everyone exactly where they belong. For the great salt cellar, that heavy ornamented vessel that could be a genuine work of the goldsmith's art, sat at a fixed point along the Lord's high table, and your place relative to it announced your rank to the entire hall. To sit above the salt, nearer the head of the table and the Lord himself, was to be honoured, noble, welcome among equals. To sit below the salt, down the long descending board with the lesser guests and the household servants, was to know your modest station with perfect clarity. Every meal a gentle, seasoned reminder that you were, socially speaking, seated in the cheap pew. It is the sort of arrangement that turns a condiment into a courtroom, and one imagines many a proud guest counting the inches between themselves and the cellar with the keen anxiety of a man checking his airline seat number. And there is one more small courtesy of the salt you must learn before you rise, for you must never pass the salt directly from your hand into another's. To hand salt hand to hand is to hand along bad luck with it. Help me to salt, Help me to sorrow, the old saying warns. And so the polite thing, then as in some quiet corners still, is to set the dish down upon the table and let your neighbour lift it themselves, so that no ill fortune travels finger to finger across the board. Historians still argue whether the darkest association of all, the linking of spilled salt with treachery and with Judas himself, truly reaches back into these deep medieval centuries or was read backward into them by later ages. You may have in your mind's eye that famous painting, where an overturned salt cellar sits before the betrayer, but be honest with the chronology as you fall towards sleep. Leonardo da Vinci painted his Last Supper, in the last years of the 15th century and the Renaissance, well after the high medieval world you have been wandering through. The tidy image of Judas and the spilled salt is later iconography, even if the older, vaguer instinct that spilled salt whispers of betrayal and broken trust may be genuinely ancient. The link is old, the painting is not, and both things can be true at once in the soft blur of history. So you leave the salt where it lies, blessed and dreaded and quietly powerful, and you let your eyes grow heavier still. And when at last the cold drives you indoors, away from the wells and the whispering thresholds, you follow the one smell that has been pulling at every hungry soul in this village since before the bells rang for dawn, the warm, yeasty, faintly sweet breath of baking bread, drifting out from under a door and settling over the lane like a blessing you can taste. Come inside now, and let your eyes adjust to the dimness, because here, in the low room where the fire never quite goes out, you have stepped into the most sacred and superstitious corner of the whole medieval world. Not the church, though we will get there, the kitchen, the hearth, the place where flour and water and a little living leaven are turned, night after night, into the one thing no one at this table could imagine living without. Because bread, to the people warming their hands beside you, is not merely food. It is the staff of life, a phrase already old when your grandmother's grandmother used it, drawn from the Psalms and worn smooth by centuries of tired mouths. It is the substance you pray for by name every single day. Give us this day our daily bread, the only foodstuff important enough to earn its own line in the prayer that the whole of Christendom knows by heart. And it is more than that still, because at the very centre of the medieval faith stands a loaf. When the priest lifts the wafer at the altar and murmurs the words of consecration, the people around you believe, with a seriousness that is difficult to overstate, that the bread has become the actual body of Christ, the host, from the Latin hostia, meaning a sacrifice. So bread is bound up in the deepest fibres of this world, with God made touchable, God made edible, God small enough to rest on a trembling tongue. Small wonder, then, that no one here treats an ordinary loaf as if it were merely lunch. Watch the woman at the trough as she works the dough, her sleeves pushed back, her knuckles pale with flour. Before she leaves it to rise, she draws her thumb across the top in the shape of a cross, pressing the sign gently into the soft surface. She will tell you, if you ask, that this is to let the devil out, that the cross opens a little door for whatever mischief might be trapped in the swelling dough, and lets it escape before the loaf goes anywhere near the fire. Others will tell you it is to bless the rising, to invite God to lift the bread the way only God can, since the strange, invisible magic of leaven, dough breathing and growing all on its own in a warm, dark corner, was exactly the sort of everyday miracle that felt like it needed watching. Either way, the cross is not decoration. It is insurance. And here is the real, well-documented fact to carry into sleep tonight. This humble habit of scoring a cross into bread is genuinely ancient and genuinely widespread across medieval Europe, and it is the direct ancestor of the hot cross bun you may still eat at Easter, whose slashed cross was believed to guard the household and, oddly enough, to never grow mouldy if baked on Good Friday. A loaf you could supposedly hang from the rafters all year as a charm against misfortune and shipwreck. People really did keep them up there going hard as stone, a little edible saint gathering cobwebs in the smoke. For the great fear, the fear the cross is meant to answer, is that the bread might not rise at all, and when a batch failed, when the dough sat sullen and flat and refused to breathe, the medieval mind did not reach first for a discussion of yeast temperatures and fermentation, partly because no one would understand what on earth you were talking about. No, a loaf that would not rise had been meddled with. A witch had passed too close, or cast an envious eye over the trough. The devil had breathed his cold breath on the leaven. Some ill-wisher had soured the whole business out of spite. The oven, the leaven, the very act of raising bread from nothing was so mysterious that it seemed to sit right on the border between the natural and the supernatural, and anything that lived on that border could, everyone agreed, be got at by unfriendly forces. A good baker was therefore a slightly nervous baker, and I say that with sympathy, because anyone who has watched a promising loaf collapse into a sad pale disk knows the exact flavour of that betrayal. And once the bread is baked and cut, the superstition does not stop. It simply moves to the table. Whatever you do this evening, do not turn the cut loaf upside down. Lay it wrong way up on these boards and you will draw every anxious eye in the room, because a loaf turned on its back is one of the unluckiest things a careless hand can do. In some tellings, it invites the devil straight in to sit at your table. In others, and this is the version that lingers, an upturned loaf means a sailor will drown, a ship will founder, someone far out on the grey water will not come home. Historians still argue whether that particular dread of the inverted loaf reaches all the way back into the deep Middle Ages or crystallised only in the folk memory of later centuries, but the feeling behind it is unmistakably medieval. The conviction that the way you handle your bread is quietly tangled up with life and death somewhere over the horizon. So the loaf sits upright, always, cross-side to heaven, and no one thinks twice about a rule that would sound to you faintly insane. Behind all of this glows the hearth itself, and you would do well to give it a respectful glance before you settle. To these people, the fire in the middle of the home is not just warmth and cooking heat. It is a kind of living threshold, a doorway that is never entirely closed, through which the outside world and the other world might both come and go. The chimney, or the smoke hole in the older houses, was thought to be a favourite route for spirits, for witches, for whatever wandered in the dark, which is one reason a cross was so often scratched near the hearth, and why salt was flung into the flames, and why the fire was so carefully banked at night rather than left to die. To let the hearth fire go out entirely was more than an inconvenience. It felt, obscurely, like letting the soul of the house go cold, and rekindling it sometimes carried its own small rituals and prayers. The truth of it, and you may smile at this as you drift, is that the medieval kitchen ran on faith and flour in almost equal measure, and it is a genuine wonder anyone found the time to actually eat. There is one more loaf to notice before your eyes grow too heavy, and it belongs to the parish. On Sundays, after Mass, in many churches across France and England and beyond, ordinary blessed bread was shared among the congregation, not the consecrated host, which only the priest received, but common loaves, brought by the villagers in turn and sanctified with a prayer, then broken and passed hand to hand down the pews. The French called it pain béni, holy bread, and it carried something of the church home into the kitchen, a warm thread stitching the altar to the hearth you are now dozing beside. People pressed crumbs of it into the mouths of the sick, tucked morsels into cradles, even fed flakes to ailing animals, trusting that a little of the parish's blessing had soaked into the crust. And so the circle closes softly, the bread you smelled from the lane, the cross pressed into the dough, the loaf kept carefully upright, the fire guarded against the dark, and the holy loaf shared in the cold nave, all of it one long, unbroken prayer that the world would be kind, and that tomorrow, God willing and the leaven rising, there would be bread again. And so you drift on through the sleeping village, past shuttered windows and the low red glow of banked fires, until you come to stand at the one place every medieval soul treated with a quiet, prickling respect: the threshold, the doorway, that narrow band of worn stone or oak sill where the inside becomes the outside, where warmth and lamplight give way to the dark and the wind and whatever the dark might be carrying. To the medieval mind, the door was never merely a door. It was a seam in the world, a liminal boundary, a place that belonged fully neither to the house nor to the road, and anything that lives in the space between two certainties was, understandably, regarded with a great deal of caution. You pause your palm on the timber and feel how cold it is compared to the hearth behind you, and you begin to understand why people fussed over it so. For a boundary is only as strong as its weakest crossing, and the door was the weak point in every wall you owned. You could build your house of good stone and stout beams, you could trust your roof and your locked chest, but the door stood open a dozen times a day, and each opening was an invitation that evil, being famously bad at reading social cues, might choose to accept. So the threshold became a place of small rituals, tiny defensive habits performed so automatically that most people forgot they were performing them at all. You step over a sill, you do not step on it, you cross carefully. And when a new bride came to her husband's house, she did not walk across that boundary on her own feet at all, but was lifted and carried over it, a custom already old by the medieval centuries and stretching back to the Romans. The tidy explanations came later, of course, murmuring that a bride who stumbled, on the threshold would bring bad luck to the marriage, or that the doorway swarmed with lurking spirits eager to trouble a woman at the most vulnerable moment of her new life. Whether anyone truly believed the spirits were queuing at the sill or simply enjoyed watching the groom try not to drop his wife, the carrying endured, which is more than can be said for most wedding advice. Above that dangerous doorway, in many a later medieval and early modern home, you would find iron pressed into service, for iron was the great enemy of the uncanny, cold-forged and fireborn and utterly unmagical, and things that dwell in the dark were said to loathe it. Here is a real fact worth holding as you grow drowsy. The belief in iron's protective power is genuinely ancient, older than the Middle Ages by many centuries, running through Roman and earlier folk practice long before a single medieval blacksmith bent a horseshoe. And the horseshoe itself, that most famous of doorway charms, you would see nailed up with its points turned upward, a cup to hold the luck in because a horseshoe hung the other way, everyone agreed, would let all the good fortune drain sadly out onto the step like water from a tipped bowl. It combined two potent things at once, the shape of a crescent and the iron it was forged from, a sort of belt and braces approach to the supernatural. Honesty compels a gentle note here that the horseshoe over the door tradition is best documented in later folk custom, rather than firmly in the earlier medieval record. So picture it as a habit deepening across the centuries rather than a thing every peasant did in the year 1200. Then there were the marks. Run your fingers along the timber near the doorframe, near the hearth, near the windows, and in a great many surviving buildings you will find them scratched and burned and gouged into the wood and stone, interlocking loops, tangled lines, and above all the daisy wheel, that endless compass-drawn flower of 6 petals enclosed in a circle. Scholars call these apotropaic marks, from a Greek word meaning to turn away evil, and the daisy wheel, the hexafoil, is the most common of them all. Its magic was thought to lie in its unbroken line. A demon or a wandering spirit, being pathologically tidy-minded, would be compelled to trace the endless path round and never find its way out, trapped in the doodle until dawn. Oddly enough, the very same 6-petaled figure was also used quite innocently by carpenters as a practical geometry mark, which means that some of the witch marks, so breathlessly discovered in old houses, may simply be a medieval builder's version of measuring twice and cutting once. Historians still argue whether a given hexafoil was scratched to snare a demon or merely to lay out a joint, and the truth is that the same hand might have meant both at once. Protection and geometry tangled together like the lines themselves. You will find other guardians tucked about the house too, if you know where to look. A branch of rowan, the mountain ash, nailed above the door or bound into the rafters, for rowan was reckoned proof against ill-wishing. An iron nail driven where no one would see it, and most touching of all, concealed within the very fabric of the walls, up chimneys and under floors and beside hearths, the shoes, single-worn shoes, deliberately hidden, a genuinely medieval practice with examples surviving from the 14th century onward, including one famously wedged into the masonry of Winchester Cathedral. Why a shoe of all things, no one can quite say, though the leading guess is that a shoe holds the shape of the person who wore. It and so could lure and trap a prowling spirit, a decoy foot for a creature too foolish to notice the rest of the body was missing. The witch bottles, those little stoneware jars packed with pins and stranger things and buried at the threshold to turn a curse back on its sender, belong mostly to the early modern centuries rather than the medieval ones. So let them sit at the edge of your drifting thoughts as a later chapter of the same long, anxious wish. The wish always was the same, to keep the door strong, to keep the dark on its own side of the sill, and to sleep as you are nearly sleeping now, safe within a well-marked wall. And so, as the last of that talk of charms and whispered words settles into the dark like dust onto a windowsill, you drift toward the one substance the medieval world trusted above almost any other to hold the unseen at bay. Not gold, not silver, not any pretty thing, but plain, dull, dependable iron. Cold iron, they called it, and they said it with a kind of reverence, because iron was the metal that fairies could not abide, that witches shrank from, that spirits could not cross. You carry a nail in your pocket as you walk this hushed village lane, and you are not being foolish, you are being sensible, by the standards of everyone who ever lived here. A horseshoe over the lintel, a knife laid flat beneath the cradle, an iron key pressed into a frightened hand. These were the household defences of a world that took the borders between the living and the uncanny very seriously indeed. There is a real, sturdy old belief threaded through all of this, and it runs like this. The fair folk, the good neighbours, the hidden people of the hollow hills, belong to an older order of the world, and iron was the metal of a newer one, worked by fire, hammered by human hands, torn out of the earth and tamed. To touch cold iron to a fairy was to touch it with the whole weight of that human, forged mortal world, and the old powers, so the story went, simply could not bear the contact. You will find this in folk record after folk record across Britain, Scandinavia, and beyond. The changeling repelled by an iron blade, the door protected by an iron latch, the churn that would not yield butter until an iron nail was dropped inside. It is one of the most widespread protective beliefs in all of European folklore, and it is genuinely ancient, older, very likely, than any of the saints we're about to meet. Which brings you, softly, to the man who made the iron. The blacksmith in the medieval imagination was never quite an ordinary tradesman. He stood at his forge in a cave of red light, coaxing metal to glow and bend and obey, bending the very element that frightened the fairies. And so people half suspected he was a little magical himself, a man who had made some private arrangement with fire. If you have ever met someone who could parallel park on the first try, you know roughly the level of quiet suspicion involved. And the patron saint of these smoke-blackened, half-enchanted men was Dunstan, a real historical figure, a 10th century monk who became Archbishop of Canterbury, and was, by all accounts, a genuinely skilled metalworker in his own right. Around him grew the finest smithing legend of them all. The story runs that Dunstan was at his forge one evening when the devil himself came calling, in one disguise or another, hoping to tempt the holy man off his stool. Dunstan, unbothered, waited until his tongs were glowing white in the coals, and then seized the devil neatly by the nose. And here every version of the tale agrees delightedly that the devil went howling off across the countryside nursing a very sore snout. In the other, even better version, the devil comes asking to have his own cloven hoof shod, and Dunstan, recognising his customer, drives the nails in so cruelly and works the iron so hard that the devil begs for mercy, and Dunstan will only release him on the promise that he will never enter a house with a horseshoe nailed above its door. And that, the medievals told one another with great satisfaction, is why you hang the horseshoe up at all. Oddly enough, the argument over which way up to hang it, points up to cradle the luck, or points down to pour it over the threshold, is a quarrel that has never once been settled and is still cheerfully going on in farmyards today. So the horseshoe returns to you now not merely as a token of luck, but as iron luck, doubly armoured. The metal that fairies flee, blessed by a saint who tweaked the devil's nose. Historians still argue whether the horseshoe over the door custom truly descends from the Dunstan legend, or whether the pious story was stitched on afterward to explain a habit people already had, and, as with so much in this hushed world, the honest answer is that nobody can be entirely sure. Either way, the nail holes in an old iron shoe were said to matter, 7 of them, a number already heavy with its own quiet power, and a shoe found lying in the road, rather than bought, was luckiest of all, as though the luck had to arrive by accident to count. But iron on the doorframe guarded only the house, and the medieval world needed a larger voice, something that could throw its protection out across whole fields and rooftops and the low, threatening bellies of storm clouds. That voice was the church bell, consecrated metal, hung high, and rung not merely to call people to prayer but to drive things away, to scatter demons riding the wind, to break apart the poisoned plague-bearing air, and above all to shatter the coming storm before its lightning could fall. Bell ringers climbed into swaying towers in the teeth of a tempest to sound the great bronze against the thunder, which, given that a bell tower is essentially the tallest metal-topped spike for miles, was a decision of truly heroic optimism. And here is the loveliest, strangest detail of all. They wrote the bell's purpose right onto its body in Latin, cast into the bronze as it cooled. Many a medieval bell bore some version of the line Vivos voco, Mortuos plango, Fulgura frango, I call the living, I mourn the dead, I break the lightning. That last phrase, Fulgura frango, was no idle boast to the people below. They believed the consecrated sound itself, blessed and named and flung out over the parish, could tear a storm apart and send the demons in it fleeing. So you stand in the dark now between 2 kinds of iron, the small cold nail in your pocket and the great singing bronze in the tower, and you let the last long note roll out over the sleeping fields and fade, and so, with the smell of tallow still clinging to your sleeve, you drift from the world of charms and warding signs into something quieter and more orderly, though no less anxious. the tyranny of the calendar itself. Because for the medieval mind, it was not enough to fear black cats and comets and the itching of a left palm. You also had to fear the days, the plain, unremarkable days, some of which had been quietly marked out as poisoned long before you were born. Picture the great parchment calendar hanging in the sacristy, or the little folding almanac a physician carries looped to his belt, and notice the small crosses or ominous letters set beside certain dates. Those, you are told in a hush, are the dies Egyptici, the Egyptian days, the dismal days, and on those days you do not open a vein, you do not begin a journey, you do not plant, marry, sign, sow, or start anything you actually want to succeed. The Egyptian days are genuinely, verifiably medieval, and this is your one solid fact to hold on to as you sink deeper into the pillow. Across medieval Europe there were reckoned to be 2 unlucky days in every month, 24 across the whole year, and they appear again and again in real manuscripts, in psalters and computers' tables and physicians' handbooks, sometimes flagged with a tidy little D or a warning verse in the margin. Why Egyptian? Nobody in the monastery entirely agreed. Some said the priests of ancient Egypt had first charted these evil dates by the stars. Others tied them, rather grimly, to the plagues that once fell upon Egypt in scripture. And here is the strange part. The tidbit worth tucking away as you yawn. That very word dismal, the one you still use today for a rainy Tuesday or a bad mood, comes straight down to us from these days, from the Latin dies mali, the evil days, which slid together into dismal and never quite let go. So every time somebody complains that the weather is dismal, they are, without the faintest idea of it, muttering a scrap of medieval astrological dread. The most feared use of an Egyptian day was the letting of blood. Medieval medicine adored bloodletting the way we adore a good night's sleep, and the physician kept careful tables of when the veins could be safely opened, and when opening them would practically invite the grave to breakfast. To bleed a patient on a dismal day was thought to be reckless, even lethal, and a cautious barber surgeon would sooner send you home unbled than risk it, which, all things considered, was probably the healthiest advice he gave all week. Travel was the second great dread. To set out on the road on an Egyptian day was to court robbers, broken wheels, foundering horses, and every misfortune the muddy road could offer, and since medieval roads offered a truly generous selection of misfortunes even on good days, one rather sympathises with the traveller who simply pulled the blanket over his head and decided tomorrow would do. And then, woven through all of it, come the dangerous numbers, and none so dangerous as 13. You have surely felt the little shiver already, and the medieval world felt it too, though its reasons were tender and specific. The dread of 13 at a table grew from the Last Supper, where 13 sat down together, the 12 apostles and their Lord, and one of the 13 would betray, and one would not live out the season. From this came the long, stubborn belief that 13 gathered at a meal meant one of them would die within the year, and the truly nervous host would rather leave a chair conspicuously empty or hurry to find a 14th guest than serve supper to a doomed count of 13. It is a superstition that has proved remarkably difficult to kill, which is either a testament to the power of a good story or simply proof that people will believe almost anything before they will risk being the one who dies. Friday kept company with 13 in the medieval imagination, though the two had not yet married into the single unlucky Friday the 13th we know now. That particular pairing is a much later invention. On its own, though, Friday already carried a heavy reputation, for it was the day of the crucifixion, the day the sky was said to have darkened, and so it was widely held to be an unwholesome day to marry, to move house, to begin a voyage, or to start any work you hope to finish. Historians still argue whether ordinary medieval folk truly reshuffled their whole week around Friday's gloom, or whether much of that dread was talked up by later moralists, and almanac sellers looking to fill a page. But the belief is old, and it ran deep, and more than one wedding was quietly nudged to a Thursday to keep the saints on side. The truth is that almost every threshold of a life had its lucky and unlucky hour. The moment of your birth was read against the moon and the stars so that a child born under one sign might be marked for fortune and another for sorrow before it had drawn 3 breaths. The choosing of a wedding day was a small science of its own, avoiding Fridays and dismal days and the wrong phase of the moon, and even burial had its favoured and forbidden times, its proper hours and its unquiet ones. To be born, wed, or buried on the wrong day was to begin, or end, on the back foot, and no amount of good behaviour afterward was thought quite able to make up the difference. Which does raise the gentle question of what you were supposed to do if you happened to be born, married, and buried entirely by other people's scheduling, but medieval logic tended not to dwell on such awkward details. Guiding all of this, the bleeding, the travelling, the marrying, the sewing, was the humble almanac and the patient art of computus, the reckoning by which the church fixed its moving feasts above all the date of Easter. Computus was serious, learned mathematics. Monks bent over tables of golden numbers and lunar cycles by candlelight, and out of that same machinery of calendar keeping tumbled the everyday almanac, a portable little bundle telling you the phases of the moon, the good days and the Egyptian ones, the hours to bleed and the hours to rest. So you carried your small paper oracle, and you consulted it before you did nearly anything, trusting that somewhere between the mathematics and the marginal crosses lay the difference between a day that would love you and a day that quietly would not. And with that thought, that even time itself was taking sides, you let the calendar blur and drift on. And so you drift on, out of the smoky warmth of the last room and toward a quieter corner of the house, where a small disc of polished metal hangs on the wall and catches the candle's glow. Lean in, if you like, and consider the strange little person who leans back at you out of the shining surface, because to a great many people across the medieval centuries that figure was not simply a trick of light. It was, they half believed, a sliver of you, a borrowed piece of the soul, loaned out to the shining world and, they hoped, given safely back when you stepped away. That is the old, deep idea humming underneath so much mirror lore, that a reflection holds part of the self. You see it in the way people spoke of ponds and polished shields and the dark backs of spoons long before anyone had a proper looking glass. A reflection was a kind of ghostly twin, thin and trembling on the water, and if something happened to the reflection, some quiet corner of the mind worried that something might happen to you. It is a very human anxiety, really. The suspicion that the universe is keeping a second copy of you somewhere and might not be storing it carefully. Now, before we get carried away picturing grand silvered glass, let us be honest about what a medieval mirror actually was, because the shimmering wall-sized looking glasses of later centuries simply were not here yet. For most of the Middle Ages, a mirror, a speculum in the Latin, and was a small round plate of polished metal. Bronze, tin, silver for the wealthy, sometimes an alloy buffed until it gave back a dim, coppery, slightly swimmy version of your face. If you have ever tried to admire yourself in the bottom of a well-scrubbed pan, you already know roughly what the age had to work with. Glass mirrors backed with metal did exist in small, precious, cloudy forms, and the truly clear glass-looking glass, the Venetian marvel with its tin and mercury backing, only really came into its own toward the end of the medieval world and after it. So when we talk about breaking mirrors and covering mirrors, picture something humbler and more metallic than the thing on your own bedroom wall. Here is the one plainly real fact to carry off to sleep with you. The very word we use, mirror, comes through Old French mireur from the Latin mirare, meaning to wonder at or to marvel, and the same root that gives us miracle and admire. The mirror was, from its name onward, an object of wonder, and people treated it accordingly. Because a reflection was felt to hold something of the soul, the mirror became especially dangerous at the threshold of death. In many places, the custom was that when someone died in the house, you covered every mirror with a cloth, or turned it to face the wall, and stilled or covered any standing water as well. The reasoning ran along two soft and shivery lines. If the soul was loosening itself from the body and drifting free, a mirror might catch it and trap it, keeping the departed tethered to the house instead of going where it ought to go, and more nervously still, a living person who glanced into an uncovered mirror in a room where death had just passed might see the reflection carried off, or might meet a second face that was not their own. Practical households simply threw a sheet over the glass and got on with their grieving, which is the medieval attitude in a nutshell: hedge every bet and dust the furniture later. The fear of a broken mirror grew out of the same soil, though the tidy 7 years of bad luck tariff is mostly a later and more Roman-flavoured refinement. The core dread is older and simpler. If the mirror holds a piece of you, then shattering it shatters that piece, and the shining twin comes apart, into a dozen sharp little strangers on the floor. Oddly enough, that anxiety made a certain grim sense with the mirrors people actually owned, because a dropped bronze disc rarely broke at all. It dented and warped, giving your reflection a lumpy funhouse sag that must have looked genuinely cursed by candlelight, as if the object were mocking you on the soul's behalf. But the mirror was not only something to fear for the soul's sake, it was also a doorway, and this is where we drift toward the truly forbidden. All across the medieval world and long before it, People gazed into shining surfaces to see what the eyes alone could not. Mirrors, yes, but also polished stones and crystals, the still black water of a basin, the flat of a fingernail smeared with the oil, a sword blade, a cup of wine. The practice is scrying, and its practitioners had a name that reached back through the very word for mirror, the speculari, the mirror gazers, listed by name among the diviners that the 12th century courtier and scholar, John of Salisbury, set down with weary disapproval in his great book the Polycraticus, alongside all the other people who claimed to read tomorrow in the surface of things. A boy or a young maiden was often chosen to do the actual gazing, on the tender theory that innocent eyes saw more clearly into the shimmer, which meant that a good deal of medieval fortune-telling depended on staring at a bowl of water until a child got dizzy enough to describe something. And here the church stiffened, because divination of this kind sat squarely in the territory it most distrusted. To read the future in a mirror was, in the eyes of many churchmen, either self-deception or a quiet conversation with something that had no business answering. A demon crouched in the reflection, wearing the borrowed face of the knowledge. Historians still argue whether the specularii and their basins were ever an organised craft with real technique, or simply a scattered folk habit that clerics lumped together, and gave a frightening Latin label so they could preach against it. Either way, the sermons and the penitentials warned the faithful away from the shining bowl, and warned them twice as sternly against trusting whatever leaned out of it to smile. So step back now from the little polished disc on the wall and let it go dim again. Give it no piece of yourself tonight. Let the metal keep its cold, empty wonder, and let your own reflection stay quietly, safely, where it belongs, behind your own tired eyes, sinking softly towards sleep. And so you turn from the cold glass towards something warmer and closer, something that has been with you this whole walk without you're ever once thinking about it. The small, steady tide of your own breathing, the rise and fall you carry through every dim room and down every stone stair. For the medieval mind, that quiet motion was never merely air. It was the soul made audible, the living spirit sitting just behind your teeth, and it was watched with the same nervous care that people gave to comets and black cats, and the moon going the wrong shade of red. Breath was life. Breath was the animating flicker God had puffed into the first clay man, and anything that disturbed it, a cough, a yawn, a hiccup, and above all a sudden, violent sneeze, was treated as a tiny crisis of the spirit, a moment when the door of the body swung briefly open and something might slip in or slip out. Consider the sneeze, that most sudden and undignified of all human noises. To you it is a nuisance, a reason to fumble for a handkerchief. To your medieval companion walking beside you in the dark, it was a genuine little emergency. There was an old and widespread belief, older even than the Middle Ages and inherited from the ancient world, that in the great convulsion of a sneeze the soul itself was flung loose, that for one heartbeat it hovered half out of the nostrils, unmoored, exposed, and that a passing devil or a stray scrap of evil might take that instant to either snatch the soul away or wriggle in through the undefended opening. And so the person nearby did the only sensible thing, which was to offer a blessing at once, before that undefended instant could be used against you. God bless you, they said, and meant it not as politeness, but as a small act of spiritual first aid. A verbal door slammed shut against whatever was hovering. It is, when you think about it, a rather generous system, in which total strangers are contractually obliged to guard your soul every time your nose betrays you. The story that medieval Christians love to tell about where this custom came from reaches back to the very end of the 6th century and to Pope Gregory the Great, who by tradition sat in Rome while a terrible pestilence swept through the city. The plague, so the tale goes, announced itself with a fit of violent sneezing, and to sneeze in those days could feel very much like receiving a sentence. Gregory, according to the traditional account, urged his frightened flock to answer every sneeze with an immediate prayer, God bless you, or in the older telling a solemn God have mercy, so that heaven might be petitioned in the very instant that death seemed to knock. Now it must be said gently, in the soft voice of someone who does not want to wake you. This origin story is cherished lore rather than firmly documented fact, the kind of tidy explanation later ages love to pin to an old habit. Historians still argue whether the blessing truly began with Gregory and his plague at all, or whether it was already an ancient reflex. The Romans and Greeks had said their own protective words over sneezes centuries before, that simply got dressed up in a papal robe once people wanted a Christian reason for it. Here is your one solid, unembroidered fact to hold on to as you drift. The custom of saying something protective over a sneeze is genuinely ancient and genuinely cross-cultural, far older than the medieval church, recorded among the Greeks and Romans and echoed in cultures scattered right across the world, which is why so many peoples who never met and never traded a single word still to this day murmur a blessing the moment someone nearby goes to pieces. And here is the quirky little tidbit tucked beside it. The strange part that lingers. In the old thinking, a sneeze was not always bad news. Oddly enough, sneezes were read like any other omen, and their meaning depended on timing and direction. A sneeze to the right was lucky, a sneeze to the left decidedly not, and a sneeze at the precise moment you spoke of something you hoped was true was taken as heaven itself nodding along, quietly confirming that yes, this once, you were right. But the sneeze was only the loudest of the body's little doors. There was also the yawn, that slow, helpless opening of the mouth that you're very possibly doing right now, warm and drowsy in the dark. The medieval yawn carried its own quiet dread. For a mouth stretched wide was a mouth left unguarded, an open gate through which, people whispered, the devil might stroll in as easily as a draft under a door. This is precisely why the reflex of covering the mouth was not first a matter of manners but a matter of defence, and why some pious souls would trace a small cross over their parted lips, sealing the threshold before anything unwelcome could saunter across it. One imagines the devil, endlessly patient, waiting by 1,000 tired mouths across Christendom and being foiled again and again by nothing more than a politely raised hand, which does seem like a rather humbling career for a prince of darkness. And breath ran through all of it as the golden thread. To breathe was to hold your portion of the divine spirit. The very word for spirit and the very word for breath were tangled together in the old tongues, so that to lose your breath and to lose your soul felt like cousins, if not twins. A dying person's last exhalation was watched with tender attention, sometimes caught, they said, by a loved one leaning close, as though the soul departed on that final warm sigh. Even the hiccup found its place in this anxious catalogue of the body. Those small, involuntary jolts were taken as a sign that someone, somewhere, was speaking your name or thinking ill of you. A little internal alarm bell rung by distant gossip. A twitching eyelid foretold a coming visitor or coming tears. A ringing ear meant you were being talked about, the right ear kindly and the left ear cruelly, because of course the medieval world could not resist sorting even the inside of your own head into lucky and unlucky halves. Your body, in short, was a whole quiet orchestra of omens, forever tuning itself and forever being read. And tonight you may let every one of those signals soften, and simply feel the slow, safe, blessed rise and fall of your own untroubled breath. And so you drift on from the reading of stars overhead to the reading of the sky itself, that great changeable ceiling under which the whole medieval world lived and laboured, and here the superstition softens into something you might almost call a science, a patient, weather-beaten wisdom pressed into little rhymes so they would not be forgotten. For the medieval farmer and the medieval sailor had no glass barometer, no forecast crackling out of a wooden box, no cheerful person pointing at a map of clouds. They had only their own two eyes, the ache in an old knee, and the long memory of every grandfather who had ever squinted at a sunset and made a guess. And you would be astonished how often the guess was right. Consider the oldest and most beloved of them all, the one you likely murmured yourself as a child without ever wondering where it came from. Red sky at night, shepherd's delight. Red sky in the morning, shepherd's warning. It feels timeless, and it very nearly is. This little couplet is genuinely ancient, so ancient that a version of it appears in the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus gently scolds the Pharisees, telling them that when it's evening they say fair weather is coming, for the sky is red, and in the morning they say there will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and lowering. And here is the real fact worth holding on to. Warm as a coal in the palm. The shepherds and the fishermen were not merely being poetic. In the mid-latitudes weather tends to arrive from the west, and a glowing red evening sky means the setting sun is shining through dry, dust-laden air already to the west. Air that is drifting your way to bring a fair tomorrow. A red morning sky means that clear western air has already passed overhead and gone, and wetter, angrier weather may be rolling in behind it. The rhyme, in other words, works. The shepherds had reverse-engineered a genuine principle of atmospheric physics several centuries before anyone thought to give it a name, purely by being cold and outdoors and paying attention, which is more than most of us manage on a good day. From the red sky your gaze drifts down to the calendar, where certain days were believed to hold the whole coming season inside them like a seed. Chief among the English weather saints stands poor St. Swithin, a real Anglo-Saxon Bishop of Winchester who died humbly around the year 862 and asked, so the story goes, to be buried outside in the open churchyard, where the sweet rain of heaven might fall upon his grave and the passing feet of ordinary folk might tread near him. A modest wish, you would think, but on the 15th of July in the year 971, the monks, deciding that so holy a man deserved a splendid shrine indoors, dug him up and carried his bones in grand procession into the cathedral, and the legend insists that the heavens opened in protest and wept for 40 straight days, as though the saint himself was sulking at being moved out of his beloved reign. Thus was born the rhyme still muttered every summer, St. Swithin's Day, if thou dost reign, for 40 days it will remain. St. Swithin's Day, if thou be fair, for 40 days 'twill rain no mair. Whether it actually rains for 40 days is, of course, another matter entirely, and I am sorry to report that the saint has a rather poor record with the meteorologists. Historians still argue whether the whole soggy legend was a genuine folk memory of some catastrophically wet July, or simply a tidy tale the Winchester monks polished up to explain a saint whose relics kept getting rained on. Either way, oddly enough, the number 40 is doing quiet biblical work here. 40 days of Noah's flood, 40 days of Christ in the wilderness, 40 days of Lent. For the medieval mind loved to reach for that number whenever it wanted to say a very long and meaningful while, and a wet summer felt exactly that long to a man watching his hay rot in the field. And then, at the very opposite pole of the year, in the deep cold hush of the 2nd of February, comes Candlemas, the feast of candles and of the purification, when every parish blessed the year's supply of beeswax lights and carried them flickering through the dark church. It too was pressed into weather service, and its verse is the true grandfather of that odd modern American ritual with the sleepy groundhog and his shadow. For the old saying ran, if Candlemas Day be fair and bright, winter will have another flight, but if Candlemas Day be clouds and rain, winter is gone and will not come again. A gloriously backwards little logic when you sit with it. A bright, clear February day is the bad omen, promising more frost to come, while a grey and dripping one means spring is nearly won. The peasant, shivering in the pew, was quietly hoping for miserable weather, which may be the only recorded instance in history of anyone doing so. Beyond the saints' days, the sky offered a constant running commentary to those who knew how to read it. A ring or halo around the moon, that pale ghostly circle you sometimes still catch on a cold night, was read, quite correctly, as a sign of coming rain or snow, for it is caused by high, wispy ice cloud that so often runs ahead of a storm. A hazy, watery moon meant wet. A sharp, hard, brilliant moon meant a clear frost by morning, and the animals were consulted like so many small feathered oracles, swallows flying low, cattle lying down in the meadow, sheep huddling with their backs to a coming wind, the sudden nervous chatter of rooks, the loud evening chorus of frogs, all of it noted and weighed, and much of it grounded in real animal sensitivity to the falling pressure and thickening damp that a storm pushes before it. The cow lying down before rain has been laughed at for centuries, and the cow, placidly chewing, has gone right on being correct often enough to keep the saying alive. For a sailor easing his little ship along a fog-wrapped coast, or a farmer deciding whether to cut his wheat today or gamble on tomorrow, these were not idle charms, but the difference between plenty and ruin, between coming home and not. So they watched the red west, they cursed poor Swithin, they eyed the moon's cold ring, and they trusted the cows. And you, drifting now towards sleep beneath that same unchanged and unchanging sky, might trust them a little too. And so the comet fades from the sky you have been watching, and the years roll softly forward beneath your feet, until you arrive at a season the whole of Europe would spend the rest of its life trying to forget. It is the autumn of 1347, and something is moving along the trade roads and the sea lanes, quiet as a rumour, patient as winter. You stand at the edge of a harbour town as the ships come in, and you feel the mood change before anyone says a word. The way the gulls seem too loud, the way the bells ring a half-beat wrong. Within a few years, from 1347 to 1351, the sickness men would later call the Black Death drifts across the continent like a low fog, and everywhere it goes people do the most human thing imaginable. They look up and they look back, searching the heavens and the calendar for the moment it all began. Because to the medieval mind, nothing so vast could simply happen. A single death might be misfortune, but a death that empties whole villages must be a message, and a message must have a sender. So you listen, in hushed churches and around dwindling hearths, as people reason their way toward the only conclusion their world allowed. This is punishment. Divine, deliberate, deserved. Preachers climb into their pulpits and remind their thinning congregations of Sodom, of the flood, of every wrathful chapter they can summon, and the people nod along, half terrified and half relieved, because a punishing God is at least a God who is paying attention. It is, in its bleak way, more comforting than the alternative, which is that the universe simply does not care, and if there is one thing the medieval world was never willing to entertain, it was the idea that no one upstairs was keeping notes, and once you have decided the sky is angry, you naturally begin to reread the sky for warnings you missed. Suddenly every strange thing of recent memory becomes evidence. There had been comets, of course. There were always comets, and now each one is remembered as a raised finger. There had been earthquakes and reports of foul vapours rising from cracks in the earth, and unseasonable rains, and fish behaving oddly, and all of it is gathered up like clues in a case that has already been decided. But the grandest culprit of all, the one the learned men fix upon, waits 3 years back in the record on the 20th of March 1345, when Saturn, Jupiter and Mars drew together into a single conjunction in the sign of Aquarius. Here is your real fact for the night, and it is a true one. In October of 1348, King Philip VI of France asked the medical faculty of the University of Paris, the most respected physicians in Christendom, to explain the pestilence, and their formal report blamed exactly that triple conjunction of 1345, declaring that the meeting of those 3 planets in a warm and watery sign had corrupted the very air and drawn up poisonous vapours from the earth and sea. The finest medical minds in Europe, asked for the cause of the greatest catastrophe of the age, essentially answered, it was the planets, and also the weather. One admires the confidence, even as one wishes they had washed their hands. This was the theory of miasma, the belief that disease travelled not by touch but by bad air. By a pestilent corruption you could breathe in from a foul wind or a rotting smell, and if the illness lived in the air, then the defence, sensibly enough, was to make the air around you sweeter. So you watch people all across Europe reach for the only shield they trust, the nose. They stuff their pockets and their windowsills with roses and violets, with lavender and rue, with rosemary and mint. They carry little bunches of fragrant herbs called nosegays or tussie-mussies, pressing them to their faces in the street. The wealthy burn juniper and clutch pomanders, small perforated balls of gold or silver packed with amber and musk, swinging them gently as they walk, on the theory that no plague worthy of the name would dare push its way past a really good smell. Oddly enough, and here is the strange part, this fragrant misunderstanding was not entirely useless, though never for the reason anyone believed. The smoke and the strong herbs sometimes drove off the fleas and the rats that truly carried the sickness, so people were occasionally protected by their perfume. Right idea, wrong century, wrong everything. Historians still argue whether the flowers ever meaningfully slowed the disease, or merely gave frightened people something to hold. A small sweet ritual to press against an enormous dark. But you can understand the impulse. When the world is ending, a handful of violets is not the worst thing to have in your fist. For those who wanted to bargain harder, prayer alone began to feel too gentle, and so from the towns of the German lands and beyond came the flagellants, bands of penitents who moved from city to city, stripped to the waist, striking their own backs with knotted cords as they marched and sang, offering their pain as payment for the sins they believed had summoned the plague. You watch them pass in a slow, swaying procession, 33 days of walking to mirror the years of Christ's life, and the townsfolk weep and follow, because here at last is someone doing something visible, something that looks like it might be enough. The church, watching crowds abandon their priests for these self-appointed sufferers, grew nervous fast, and by 1349 the Pope had condemned the movement. Nothing unsettles an institution quite like volunteers, and beneath all of it ran the darker current, the oldest and ugliest reflex of frightened people, the search not only for a cause but for a culprit, a face to blame. When the omens and the planets and the bad air still left the grief unexplained, communities turned on their neighbours and their strangers, and fear did what fear so often does. But that turning is a heavier road, and the night is soft, and the herbs still smell of summer, so let the procession fade into the dusk a moment longer, and breathe the rosemary and walk on. And so, still following the thread of all these remedies and warding gestures, you come at last to a low door at the edge of the village, where the smoke curls thin from a single chimney, and someone waits who is neither quite priest nor quite physician. This is the house of the cunning folk, the wise woman, or the cunning man, the person everyone knows about and no one entirely admits to visiting. You knock softly because half the parish is asleep and the other half is pretending not to notice which way you walked. Inside, by the glow of a banked hearth, sits the one the village turns to when the milk sours for no reason, when a wedding ring vanishes, when a child will not stop shivering, or when a neighbour is quietly, unshakably certain she has been cursed. The very word cunning, oddly enough, does not mean sly here at all. It comes from an Old English root meaning simply to know, so the cunning man is, quite literally, the knowing one, the person with the knowledge. And their knowledge was gloriously broad, which is the polite way of saying they would take on absolutely anything. They healed fevers and warts and toothache with herbs and muttered words. They found lost goods and named suspected thieves, sometimes by turning a sieve balanced on shears, sometimes by peering into a bowl of still water or a polished crystal. They sold charms to make cattle thrive and butter come, and young men fall hopelessly in love. And above all, they undid the work of witches. For in a world where misfortune always had an author, the cunning folk were the ones who claimed they could lift a curse, unbind a spell and send the harm limping back the way it came. It was, you might say, a full-service arrangement, and one that placed the wise woman in the slightly awkward position of profiting from exactly the witchcraft the church was so eager to stamp out. The tools of the trade, more often than not, were words, and words worn close to the skin. You watch as a strip of parchment is cut, and upon it are inked letters and holy names. Then it is folded small, sewn into a little pouch of cloth or leather, and hung about the neck of the sick. These were the charms, the written amulets, and some of the formulas upon them were astonishingly old, far older than the trembling hand that copied them. Here is a genuine historical fact to carry into your dreams. One of the most beloved of all protective charms was the sator square. 5 Latin words, sator, arepo, tenet, opera, rotas, arranged in a grid of 5 by 5 so that they read identically across and down, forwards and backwards, a perfect little labyrinth of letters. Examples of it have been scratched into walls at Pompeii, which means it was already circulating before the year 79, and yet there it still is, 1,000 years later, being copied onto scraps of medieval parchment to guard against fire, fever, madness, and the biting of mad dogs. No one could quite agree on what it meant. One middle word, arepo, appears nowhere else in Latin, which is a wonderful problem to have when you're trying to explain your magic square to a paying customer. Historians still argue whether the sator square began as a secret Christian sign or a pagan charm later baptized into holiness, for its 25 letters can be rearranged into the words Paternoster, the opening of the Lord's Prayer laid twice in the shape of a cross, with the letters A and O, Alpha and Omega, left over at the corners. Whether that hidden cross was the whole point or a happy accident discovered long after the fact, no one living can say. You fold the square away and admire, quietly, how a puzzle can outlive every empire that ever tried to solve it. Then there is the most famous word of all, the one that has tumbled down the centuries into every stage magician's patter, abracadabra. And here is the strange part. It was not invented for pulling rabbits from hats, but prescribed, in all seriousness, by a Roman physician named Quintus Serenus Simonicus, in a medical poem meant to cure a burning fever. You write the word out in full on the first line, then again below it with the last letter dropped, and again, each line shorter than the one before, until the letters dwindle down to a single lonely A, and the whole thing hangs on the page like an inverted triangle, a funnel narrowing to nothing. The idea, tender in its logic, was that as the word wasted away line by line, so too would the fever waste away in the body. The little cone of parchment was worn round the neck for 9 days and then, in the older recipe, flung backward over the shoulder into a stream running east, presumably so the illness would float off downriver and become somebody else's problem entirely. Alongside these you find charms that are nakedly, comfortingly Christian. The names of the 3 kings, Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, invoked against the falling sickness, and to keep travellers safe on the road. The words that the soldier Longinus was said to have spoken, murmured over a wound to stop the flow of blood. The holy monogram inry, the wounds of Christ counted like beads, and this is precisely where the ground grows soft and uncertain beneath your feet. Because who, exactly, could draw the line between a prayer and a spell. A blessing spoken by a priest over a sick child was holy. The very same words spoken by the wise woman over the very same child edged toward forbidden magic. The church wrestled with this for centuries, condemning amulets and tied-on charms and love potions in one breath, while pinning saints' relics to the ill in the next, and mostly landing on a queasy compromise. It was faith if the power came from God, and superstition if it came from the words themselves. The cunning folk wisely never troubled themselves overmuch with the distinction. They simply added another amen, tied the pouch a little tighter, and sent you back out into the dark with your fever triangle warm against your chest, and the fire dying gently behind you. And so you step away from the dim little mirror and out through a low door into the night air, where the grass of the meadow is, silver with dew, and the tree line stands black against a paler sky. Because there is another neighbourhood of the unseen we have not yet visited, and it does not live in glass or water at all. It lives out here, in the hollows and the hedgerows, in the green rings on the turf and the hush beneath the oldest trees, and it is a neighbourhood you must learn to speak of very, very carefully, for the people of the medieval countryside believed, with a soft and constant certainty, that the land was shared, not only with cattle and crows and the occasional nosy neighbour, but with another people entirely, a hidden folk, quick and beautiful and easily offended, who lived just around the corner of the ordinary world and could step through into it whenever they pleased. And the first thing to understand about them is that you did not, if you had any sense at all, call them what they were. You did not say the word that we say. To name them plainly was thought to draw their sharp attention straight to you, like saying a person's name across a crowded hall, and so people reached instead for flattery and euphemism, the way you might butter up a landlord you owed rent to. You called them the good folk, the fair folk, the gentry, the good neighbours, kindly respectful names offered in the hope that a little politeness might keep them kindly in return. It is the oldest trick in the diplomatic book, really. If you cannot avoid your dangerous neighbours, at least compliment their gardening. Their favourite mark upon the world was the fairy ring, a dark circle in the meadow grass, sometimes bright green and thick, sometimes studded with a perfect round of little pale mushrooms, appearing overnight where the evening before there had been nothing. To the medieval eye, this was no puzzle of soil and spores, it was a dance floor. Here, it was said, the good neighbours had spun and reeled through the small hours to music no waking ear could hold, wearing the turf into a ring with their tireless feet. And a wise traveller did not step inside. To cross into the ring, and worse to fall asleep in it, was to risk being drawn down into their revels and coming back a night later, to find that 7 years had gone by, your friends grown old, your name half forgotten, your dinner very cold indeed. Here is the one plainly real fact to fold into your pillow tonight. 2 of the earliest and richest written accounts of this hidden people come from 2 Welsh border clergymen writing within a few years of one another in the 12th century. Walter Map, a courtier and wit at the court of King Henry II, set down a rambling, gossipy book he called De Nugus Curialium, which means, charmingly, of the trifles of courtiers, and filled it with tales of mortal men who wandered into fairy company and mortal men who married fairy brides. And Gerald of Wales, that tireless traveller and churchman, in his account of a journey through Wales, told the story of a boy named Elidire who slipped through a riverbank into an underground country of small golden-haired people, feasted among them, and lost the place forever the day he tried to carry home a single golden ball. These were not peasant whispers alone. These were learned men, in Latin, at the elbow of a king. But the tale that made mothers keep the candle, burning was darker and closer to home, and we will walk through it gently. For the good neighbours were thought to covet what was healthy and new, and nothing was newer or more precious than a fat, sleeping human baby. The fear ran that they might creep to a cradle left unwatched and take the child away into their green country, leaving in its place one of their own, a changeling, a substitute laid quietly among the blankets while the true infant was spirited off, and a household that had been visited so, the belief went, would slowly notice that the little one in the cradle was somehow altered, fretful where it had been calm, or oddly wizened, or strangely knowing, as though a much older thing were peering out through an infant's eyes. It is, when you sit with it, one of the tenderest and saddest superstitions the age produced, a story reached for by frightened parents to explain a sickness, or a change they had no other way to name, and a reminder that behind so much of this lore stands nothing more sinister than love and worry keeping watch in the dark. So the countryside armed itself softly against the theft, and its weapons were the most ordinary things in the house. Cold iron above all, a nail, a pair of open scissors, a horseshoe, a knife laid quietly beneath the cradle straw, because the good folk were thought to loathe and fear worked iron and could not abide its touch. Bread in the pocket and salt on the sill, both blessed, both stubbornly of this solid world. A red thread tied about a baby's wrist. The father's coat turned inside out and laid over the crib, on the reasoning that a thing worn backwards confuses a creature who expects the world to run in its proper grooves. And above all, the swift baptism of the child, for an unbaptized infant, was thought most exposed of all, standing as yet outside the church's guarding circle, which is why so many medieval babies were carried to the font within days of drawing breath. The water hurried a little by exactly this fear, and oddly enough the same folk who barred their door against these neighbours also left the door propped open a crack for them, setting out a saucer of milk or a crust of bread on the threshold at night, a small toll, an offering to keep the fair folk sweet, on the sensible peasant principle that a well-fed neighbour is a less troublesome one. Historians still argue whether these hidden people were ever imagined as fallen angels, too good for the pit and too proud for heaven, or as the lingering spirits of the pagan dead, or as something older still that no doctrine ever quite tamed, and the medieval sources themselves cannot agree, which is somehow exactly right for a folk who refuse to be pinned down or plainly named. So step back now from the dark ring in the grass. Do not cross it tonight. Leave your crust on the doorstep, keep your iron nail close, and walk on softly past the silver meadow, and let the good neighbours dance their tireless dance without you, far away beneath the hush of the oldest trees. Let us turn away now from the shining bowl and the demon in the glass, and walk toward gentler protection, toward the side of the medieval world that felt not forbidden, but blessed. Because for every nervous glance into a mirror, there were 100 quiet prayers pressed toward heaven, and the ordinary faithful did not face their fears alone. Above them, arranged like a vast and patient household of the dead, stood the saints, men and women who had lived and suffered and died, and who now, it was believed, sat close enough to God to whisper a word on your behalf. You did not, as a rule, pray to a saint the way you prayed to God. You asked the saint to intercede, to lean over and put in a good word, the way you might ask a well-connected uncle to mention your name to someone important. And the medieval world, being nothing if not organised, sorted its saints by specialty until heaven resembled a very long corridor of doors, each with its own patron waiting behind it, ready for the particular trouble you happened to be carrying that day. The logic of who protected what was often beautifully, painfully literal, drawn straight from the manner of the saint's own suffering. Saint Apollonia, whose torments were said to have included the breaking of her teeth, became the patron you called upon when a molar throbbed you awake at midnight, and a fair number of medieval people, mid-toothache, would murmur her name or wear a little charm inscribed with it, trusting that a saint who had endured such suffering in her own mouth would surely have sympathy for the aching of theirs. Saint Blaise, remembered for miraculously saving a child who was choking on a fishbone, became the guardian of sore and afflicted throats, and on his feast day a priest would hold 2 crossed candles against your neck and bless you against every cough and quinsy of the coming year, which is surely the only time in history that being poked in the throat with candles counted as good news. St. Margaret of Antioch, according to her wonderfully strange legend, swallowed whole by a dragon, and then bursting unharmed out of its side, became for that very reason the patron of women in childbirth. Her life story read aloud, or her girdle, relics laid across the labouring mother as she prayed for a safe and swift deliverance. And when the Great Terror came, the pestilence, the plague that darkened the 14th century and returned in waves for generations after, the faithful turned to 2 saints above all. Saint Sebastian, whose body in the old accounts was pierced with arrows, was invoked against the plague because sickness itself was so often imagined as arrows loosed from an angry heaven, and who better to shield you from those unseen shafts than the man who had already caught so many? And St. Roch, a pilgrim who was said to have nursed plague victims, caught the sickness himself and recovered, became the very patron of the afflicted and the quarantined. His image, marked with a sore on the thigh and a faithful dog at his side, hung in countless homes and chapels as a standing prayer against the thing everyone most dreaded. Here is the one plain fact to carry with you towards sleep. This pairing of saints against plague was no vague folk habit, but a documented devotion, with confraternities founded in their names, altars raised, and processions marched through stricken towns, all across the later Middle Ages and well beyond. There were saints for the road too, and the greatest of these was St. Christopher, the giant who was said to have carried the Christ-child across a river on his own shoulders, and who therefore watched over every traveller, every pilgrim, every soul setting out on a journey that might not end well. His image was painted enormous on church walls, often just inside the door, on the tender and widely held belief that whoever looked upon Christopher in the morning would not die a sudden or unshriven death that day, which meant that a great many medieval churchgoers began their morning by seeking out the biggest picture in the building and staring at it very deliberately before doing anything else. And the pilgrims who travelled to the shrines of these saints did not come home empty-handed. At every great destination, Canterbury for Thomas Becket, Compostela for St. James with his scallop shell, the countless smaller shrines dotted between, you could buy a little pilgrim badge, a cheap stamped metal token in pewter or tin, to sew onto your hat or cloak. On the surface it proved where you had been, a medieval souvenir, but in the wearing it became something more, a protective amulet carrying a breath of the saint's power home with you, warding sickness and misfortune along the muddy road. And here is the strange part, oddly enough. So many were made and lost and dropped into rivers as offerings that pilgrim badges are among the most common medieval objects still dug from the mud today. Thousands upon thousands of them, a whole scattered rosary of other people's hopes. Nor did protection end at the saints, for the church filled the hands of the ordinary faithful with holy objects meant to guard the home. There was holy water, blessed and carried off in little flasks to sprinkle on the sick bed, the bier, the threshold. There were the candles blessed at Candlemas in early February, kept through the year and lit against thunderstorms and in the room of the dying. There were the palm crosses of Palm Sunday, woven and tucked behind a beam or over a door to turn away lightning and evil. And there was the strangest and most prized of all, the Agnus Dei, a small disc of wax made from the melted remnants of the great Paschal candle, stamped with the image of the Lamb of God, and blessed by the Pope himself, believed to guard the wearer against fire, flood, storm, sudden death, and the perils of childbirth. Historians still argue whether the common people drew any real line at all between using these blessed things as the Church intended and using them as frank little charms. Dropping a scrap of Agnus Dei into the foundations of a house, tying a blessed candle stub to a sick cow, sewing holy water into a pouch worn against the skin. To the parish priest it might be devotion, or it might be superstition. To the frightened soul holding the wax disc in the dark it was simply protection, and in the hush of the dark that difference hardly mattered at all, and so you drift on from the whispered charms and knotted threads, and your hand, almost without thinking, closes around the little stone hung at your throat, because in this world nothing is ever only a stone. Every pebble, every polished bead, every glinting jewel set into a ring is believed to be quietly humming with power, and there are learned men who have spent their lives writing down exactly what that power is supposed to be. These books are called lapidaries, and if you could slip into a monastery library and lift one from its chained shelf, you would find page after page cataloguing stones the way another book might catalogue saints or sins, each with its own virtue, its own danger, its own strange biography. The most famous of them all flows from the pen of a bishop, Marbode of Rennes, who around the year 1090 composed a poem in Latin verse called the Liber Lapidum, the Book of Stones. Here is your real, solid historical fact for the evening, the one to carry down into sleep with you. Marbode's little poem described the powers of some 60 stones, and it became so beloved that it survives in well over 100 medieval manuscripts, and was translated out of Latin into French, Provençal, Italian, Irish, Hebrew, and more. A genuine medieval bestseller copied and recopied across 4 centuries by people who took every glittering word entirely to heart. And the charming thing is that Marbode wasn't inventing from nothing. He was passing along older lore, some of it trickling down from a mysterious authority the texts simply call Evax, king of the Arabs, a figure so shadowy that no one has ever quite proven he existed, which did nothing whatsoever to slow anyone down. So you turn the imagined pages by candlelight, and the virtues spill out. A sapphire, deep as a twilight sky, is said to cool the fevered body, to preserve chastity and calm the heart, and to be so heavenly in nature that the clergy came to favour it above almost all others. A stone fit, they believed, for the fingers of bishops. A diamond, hardest of all, will make its wearer bold and unconquerable, drive off nighttime terrors and phantoms, and, here the lapidaries grow wonderfully confident, turn aside poison and even blunt the malice of enemies, provided, of course, you can afford one, which rather narrows the field of the invincible to people, who are already having a fairly good century. But you don't need a bishop's ransom to be protected, and this is where the humbler stones step forward. Consider the toadstone or buffonite, a small domed stone, brownish or grey, which the wise all agreed came out of the head of an old and venerable toad. To harvest one properly, the lapidaries advised, you should set the aged toad upon a red cloth and wait for it to belch the stone up, or bury it in an anthill until only the treasure remained. Instructions I invite you to try at home only if you have a great deal of patience and no friends left to lose. The toadstone, once won, was set in a ring against poison, and its magic came with a built-in alarm system. Worn near anything venomous, it was said to grow warm, to sweat, and to change colour, so that a nobleman fearing his dinner could simply glance at his knuckle. And here is the strange part, the tidbit to tuck away. Those toadstones set so proudly into medieval rings were not toad relics at all, but the fossilised button teeth of an extinct fish called lepidotes, ancient pallets that had been lying in the rock for 100 million years before some jeweller decided they had come out of an amphibian's forehead. Down at the cradle end of life, the protection is softer and redder. A branch of red coral is tied about a baby's neck or wrist, because coral is thought to fend off the evil eye, to calm childish fevers and fits, and to frighten away the demons and night hags who are believed, to crowd around the unbaptized and the very small. Marbod himself praised coral's power against storms and phantoms, and for centuries afterward you will find it strung on infants and painted into pictures of the Christ child, a little crimson twig of insurance against a frightening world. Alongside it come amber, warm and honey-coloured and faintly electric when you rub it, worn against sore throats and sorcery, and jet, that black polished coal stone which the old writers claimed would drive off snakes, unmask deceit, and repel evil spirits, and which, quite genuinely, gives off a faint resinous smoke and smell when burned, so that people swore they could literally smoke the devils out. And running underneath all of it is a conviction you must not overlook, that a stone's virtue was not simply in the stone, but in how you carried it. The lapidaries fuss endlessly over the setting. This gem must touch the bare skin to work, that one must be bound in gold, another in silver, one engraved with a particular figure, one worn on the left hand, one merely held in the mouth. Historians still argue whether the medieval public truly believed every last claim in these books, or whether the lapidaries were read as much for wonder and poetry as for practical pharmacy, half science and half enchantment, consulted the way you might consult a book of marvels. Either way, the stones were expected to earn their keep, which is a great deal of pressure to put on a pebble, and one does feel a certain sympathy for the poor sapphire lying awake at night wondering whether it has kept its owner chaste enough. So you let your fingers rest on your own small stone, warm now from your skin, and you half believe, as everyone around you does, that it is watching over you, sweating at poison, scowling at demons, cooling your fevers, holding back the dark, and with that gentle glittering armour at your throat you walk on into the deepening evening, where the beliefs grow older still, and so, as the night deepens and the road unrolls its long grey ribbon before you, the talk turns, as it always does at this hour, toward the softest and oldest of all the medieval worries, the omens that were said to whisper, gently and in advance, that someone nearby would soon be leaving. You mustn't be frightened by any of this. Think of it instead as the way our ancestors tried to make death a little less sudden, a little more announced, the way a good host lights a candle in the window so no traveller arrives entirely unexpected. And a candle, as it happens, is exactly where we begin. Far off across the Welsh hills, on nights just like this one, people watched for the Canwyll Corph, the corpse candle, a small pale flame that drifted low over the lanes and hedgerows, floating along at about the height of a person's chest, never quite touching the ground. It carried no lantern and no hand to hold it, and it moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, tracing the precise route that a coming funeral would one day take, from the doomed one's door all the way to the churchyard gate. If you saw a dim little light, folk said, the death would be that of a child. A larger, ruddier flame meant a grown soul, and two candles travelling side by side meant two would go together. It was, in its quiet way, the least dramatic ghost imaginable. No chains, no wailing, just a polite luminous scout wandering ahead to check the road conditions. The great collector of such tales, John Aubrey, wrote them down in the 17th century, and the Welsh bishop who lends his name to so many of these accounts insisted the lights were a mercy granted to his diocese in particular, so that his flock might set their affairs in order. Here is the real sober fact tucked inside the legend. Many of these drifting corpse lights almost certainly had a perfectly earthly source in the pale glow of marsh gas rising off boggy, low-lying ground. the same will-o'-the-wisp that led travellers astray across half of Europe, which is why the candles so loved damp lanes and river meadows, and rather sensibly avoided dry hilltops where nobody kept a good story going anyway. And here's the strange part. The corpse candle was thought to be so reliable that people claim to recognise their own future funeral route by it, and there are accounts of watchers who followed a light for a mile only to have it wink out at a particular threshold, the very house where, weeks later, the bell would toll. Historians still argue whether these sightings were genuine folk memory of glowing swamp gas, honest grief dressed up as prophecy, or simply the sort of tale that grows an extra candle every time it's retold by a warm fire. Whatever the truth, the corpse candle was gentle company compared with what the bolder souls did on the 24th of April, the eve of St. Mark. On that night, in villages across England, a watcher would station himself in the church porch, that shadowed stone doorway between the churchyard and the nave, and keep a silent vigil as the hours crept toward midnight. There, so the belief ran, he would see the wraiths of all those in the parish, destined to die within the coming year, pass slowly up the path and in through the door, a hushed procession of the not yet departed, each one walking in the order their death would arrive. Those who lingered longest in the doorway would sicken but recover. Those who swept straight through were marked. It was said you had to keep the watch. 3 years running before the visions came true, which frankly seems like an enormous amount of standing in a cold porch on the off chance of ruining your own week. And there was a catch built into the whole grim arrangement, because if the watcher himself was fated to die that year, why he would see his own wraith join the line, a discovery best made, one imagines, while sitting down. Inside those same old churches, tucked into the ancient oak beams and the roof timbers black with centuries of candle smoke, lived another herald of death, and this one you could actually hear. The Deathwatch beetle, a small unassuming creature that tunnels through seasoned wood, makes a faint, rhythmic tapping when it knocks its little head against the timber to call for a mate. In the deep silence of a sick room kept awake through the long night, that soft, patient tick-tick-tick was heard not as courtship but as a countdown, an unseen clock measuring out the hours a dying person had left. The name itself, Deathwatch, comes from exactly that vigil at the bedside. The quirky truth, and I do love this one, is that the beetle wasn't foretelling anything at all. It was simply a lonely insect looking for love in the wainscoting, and the only thing its tapping reliably predicted was more beetles. When the end at last drew near, the parish would ring the passing bell. A slow, single, tolling note sounded not after death but for the dying, meant to summon the neighbours to prayer and, folk hoped, to frighten off any mischief that might trouble a soul on its way out. Often the bell was rung in a code the whole village could read, a set number of strokes for a man, another for a woman, then a toll for each year of the life just ending, so that people in distant fields could count along and know exactly who was slipping away. And on the same night, without anyone touching them, the dogs would sometimes lift their heads and howl at nothing, and a clock that had ticked faithfully for 40 years would quietly, inexplicably stop, its hands frozen at the hour, as though the whole household, wood and metal and living creature alike, had paused together to hold its breath. Rest easy now. The candles are only marshlight, the beetle only wants a friend, and the road, for you, still runs gently onward. And since we are already thinking about the soul slipping loose of the body and wandering where it will, let us follow it now into the one, place it goes every single night. Down past the edge of the candlelight, past the last thought of the day, into the country of sleep, where the medieval mind believed the most important messages of all might be waiting. For to a great many people across those long centuries, a dream was never merely the mind idling, it was a letter. The only question, and it was a serious one, was who had written it. Because a dream, they were certain, could be a prophecy, a warning sent ahead of some coming grief, a glimpse of a battle not yet fought, a whisper of a death in the family before the messenger had even saddled his horse. Scripture itself gave them every reason to think so. Had not Joseph read Pharaoh's dream of the fat and lean cattle, and Daniel unravelled the king's visions in the night, and the wise men been warned in a dream to go home by another road? If God had spoken through sleep to the patriarchs, then surely, the reasoning went, he might still lean down and murmur something to a farmer in Kent or a nun in Saxony. The trouble was telling his voice apart from all the others in the dark, for there were other senders. A dream might be nothing more than your supper, too much salted fish and strong ale churning the body's humours into strange pictures, signifying precisely nothing except that you should not have had the second helping. Or, more alarming, a dream might be a temptation, a piece of theatre staged by a demon who had studied you carefully and knew exactly which false hope or secret fear would lead you astray by morning. So the medieval sleeper lay down each night in a place that was, in a sense, 3 doors at once, one opening onto heaven, one onto the digestion, and one onto something with an interest in your ruin, and had to guess, on waking, which door the night had come through. Happily, they had a filing system, and it came down to them from the late Roman world. Around the year 400, a scholar named Macrobius wrote a long, learned commentary on Cicero's Dream of Scipio, and near its opening he laid out a 5-fold sorting of dreams that medieval Europe copied and quoted for the next 1,000 years. There was the oraculum, the oracle, in which some grave and trusted figure, a parent, a priest, an angel, appears and tells you plainly what will happen and what to do. There was the visio, the prophetic vision which simply shows you a thing that later comes true. There was the somnium proper, the riddling dream that hides its truth under a veil of symbols and must be interpreted. And then there were the 2 that meant nothing. The insomnium, the mere churn of the day's worries and the body's aches, and the visum or phantasma, that flickering half-waking apparition at the very lip of sleep, when shapes press on the eyes and you feel you're falling. The first 3 were worth taking seriously. The last 2, Macrobius said, were not worth the interpreting, which has to be the oldest recorded version of a physician telling you it was just something you ate. Here is the plainly real fact to tuck under your pillow tonight. The most popular dream manual of the entire Middle Ages was a little reference book called the Somnula Danielis, the Dream Book of Daniel, and it survives today in well over 100 manuscripts, translated out of its Latin into Old English, French, German, Italian, Greek and more. One of the true medieval bestsellers, second only to the Truly Holy, books in how often it was copied. It bore the prophet Daniel's name not because he wrote it, but because he was the Bible's great reader of dreams, and slapping his name on the cover was the medieval way of writing "Trust Me" on the spine, and what a book it was. It listed dream symbols in rough alphabetical order, each with its little verdict, plain as a shopping list. To dream of flying meant a change of fortune. To dream of losing your teeth foretold the death of kin. To dream of bees might mean gain or trouble, depending on the copy, because no 2 scribes ever quite agreed. To dream of a bear, a bath, a bishop, a burning house. Each had its terse line of meaning, and a nervous sleeper could thumb through, by candlelight the next morning and receive his forecast in seconds. Oddly enough, the entries often flatly contradict the sober theology sitting on the same shelf. The Church taught that most dreams were meaningless or dangerous, yet monks copied the Somnial Danielis in monastery scriptoria all the same, sometimes tucking it into the very same volume as their prayers, which suggests that even men sworn to distrust dreams still rather wanted to know what the falling teeth meant. The chronicles kept the dream omens too, and treated them as history. When the English chronicler John of Worcester wrote of King Henry I, he recorded 3 nights on which the king dreamed that crowds of angry subjects, first ploughmen with their tools, then knights with their weapons, then bishops and abbots with their crooks, pressed in around his bed demanding relief from his taxes, and the monk even had the dreams painted into his manuscript, so that Henry's uneasy sleep survives in coloured ink to this day. Historians still argue whether such dream portents were genuinely believed by the men who wrote them down, or were a polite, deniable way for a chronicler to criticise a living king without ever quite saying so out loud. And when a soul could not wait for sleep to bring its answer, there was a waking version of the same hope, the sorts, the drawing of lots from a holy book. You would carry a burning question to church, lay your hand flat on the closed Gospels or the Psalter, and let the heavy cover fall open where it would, and the first verse your finger touched was taken as heaven's reply. Bishops and councils grumbled against it for centuries, calling it superstition dressed in Sunday clothes. And then, human nature being what it is, a fair number of those same bishops are recorded quietly doing it themselves whenever the stakes were high enough. So let the book fall closed now and ask it nothing. Let whatever comes tonight come through the gentlest of the doors, riddle or no riddle, and let it go uninterpreted till morning, as your breath slows and the dark folds softly over the last of the candle. And so, with the smell of tallow still clinging to your sleeve, you drift from the churchyard toward something warmer and stranger, the tangled business of love, courtship and marriage, where the medieval mind hedged every promise with an omen. For if a single life was ringed with signs, a shared one was practically fenced in by them, and no one, it seems, wanted to walk to the altar without first consulting the calendar, the weather, the moon, and possibly a cake baked in complete silence. Begin with the calendar, because the medievals certainly did. There were lucky days to marry and unlucky ones, and the unluckiest of all belonged to the whole soft green month of May. "Marry in May, rue the day," they murmured, and the caution was old enough to have grey hair even then, for the Romans had said much the same 1,000 years earlier. Here is a genuine historical fact to tuck under your pillow. The poet Ovid, writing at the very turn of the 1st century, recorded that the common people held it unlucky to wed in May, because the month was crowded with solemn festivals of the dead, the Lemuria, when families quieted the restless spirits of their ancestors, and, as Ovid dryly put it, only a bad wife marries when the ghosts are walking. The church layered its own reasons on top, since May often fell inside the fasting and penitence that framed the calendar, and you were not, on the whole, supposed to be feasting and dancing while the season asked you to be sorry for your sins. June, sacred once to Juno, the guardian of marriage, was the safe and smiling alternative, which is why brides have been shuffling gratefully into June ever since, mostly without the faintest idea that they are dodging Roman ghosts. The days of the week carried fortunes too, though here you must be gently honest with yourself, because the tidy little rhyme most people recite: Monday for wealth, Tuesday for health, Wednesday the best day of all, Thursday for losses, Friday for crosses, and Saturday no luck at all, and was written down in that neat sing-song form only in the 19th century, a cousin of the Monday's child is fair of face verse, and dressed up as far older than it truly is. The underlying suspicions, though, were real and medieval enough. Friday in particular was widely shunned, tangled up as it was with the day of the crucifixion, and a couple who scheduled their vows for a Friday were felt to be, let us say, tempting a fate that had quite enough to be getting on with already. Now, before any of this calendar watching could matter, a maiden had to know who the groom would even be, and here the medieval and early modern world offered a whole quiet theatre of love divination. The most beloved of these unfolded on St. Agnes's Eve, the night of the 20th of January sliding into the feast day of St. Agnes herself. Agnes was a young Roman martyr, barely more than a child, and by a fitting logic she became the patron of girls and of maidens hoping to marry. So her eve became the appointed night for a hopeful young woman to conjure a vision of her future husband in a dream. The rituals varied from village to village, but they shared a lovely shivering strictness. You were to fast all day, speak to no one, and go to bed hungry and in silence, often lying flat on your back with your hands beneath your head, sometimes scattering pins, sometimes baking a dumb cake, so called because it was made without a single word spoken, and there, in your sleep, your true love was meant to appear and offer you a taste. Here is the strange part worth savouring. In some tellings you had to walk up to bed backwards, undressing without looking behind you, which is a fine recipe for a dream of romance and an even finer recipe for stubbing your toe on the bedpost. You will meet St. Agnes's Eve again in a candlelit poem by John Keats, written in 1819, all silver and shadow, but do gently flag it in your memory as the late literary bloom of the custom rather than its root. For the folk practice was murmuring through cottages and convents long before any romantic poet dipped his pen. Historians still argue whether these divination rites were harmless village games, sincere acts of devotion to a beloved saint, or the last soft embers of something distinctly older and more pagan, quietly wearing a Christian name to be allowed indoors. And once a lover was found, the charms turned from finding to keeping. There were herbs pressed between the pages of a psalter, knots tied and untied, apple peels tossed over the shoulder, to fall in the shape of a sweetheart's initial, and yarrow gathered from a young man's grave. I promise the gathering was more tender than it sounds, all whispered over to fasten one heart to another. The wedding day itself then had to be armoured against envy, because a happy bride was thought to be exactly the sort of gleaming, enviable thing the evil eye loved to sour. So the bride was veiled. That soft screen of cloth over her face, which we now read as pure, delicate ornament, began in the far older Roman flammeum, the flame-coloured veil, worn partly to hide the bride from any ill-wishing gaze and any spirit that might covet her joy. As for something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue, I'm afraid you must be told kindly that this rhyme is Victorian, a late tidying up of scattered older luck charms rather than a genuine medieval verse, however ancient it likes to feel. The instincts behind it are far older. The old thing to carry the past's protection forward, the blue for constancy and warding, the borrowed token begged from an already happy wife so a little of her good fortune might rub off, which when you think about it is a rather gentle magic, hope stitched quietly into a hem and carried, blushing, toward the light. And so you drift from the threshold of the dying toward the threshold of the newly born, though in the medieval mind the two doorways stand closer together than you might like. For the coming of a child is not yet the soft lamplit safety we imagine, but one of the most spiritually perilous nights a household will ever keep. You stand now in a low chamber where the shutters are closed and a fire is banked high, and the women have gathered, the midwife with her worn hands, the neighbours, the mother's kin, while the men are sent to wait somewhere far off, being, as everyone agrees, entirely useless at moments like this. The room is deliberately dim and warm and sealed, because the birth time is understood as a threshold, a thin place, an hour when the mother and the child both hang half in and half out of the ordinary world, and where thresholds thin, the old fear says, unquiet things press close. So the women hush their voices, and they knot no cord, and they keep no lock fastened tight, for in some districts they will loosen every knot in the house and open every drawer and chest, on the gentle theory that a soul making its way into the world should meet no tangles and no closed doors along the road. And when the child does arrive, breathing and blinking in the firelight, the first fear is not for its little body but for its soul, which is thought to be dangling unclaimed and unguarded until the water of baptism secures it. Here is the plain historical fact beneath all the folklore. Infant mortality in the medieval centuries was so high that the church permitted and even instructed any layperson, the midwife herself, a neighbour, the father hovering uselessly in the doorway, to perform an emergency baptism on the spot if the newborn seemed likely to die before a priest could come. A few words, a little water, and the thing was done and valid. So you understand the haste, the almost breathless urgency to get a name and a blessing onto a child within days, sometimes within hours, because an unbaptized infant was believed to slip away into a shadowed nowhere, neither saved nor damned, and no mother could bear the thought. There is a tenderness in that panic, even now, across all those centuries of hush. But baptism guards the soul, and there remained the small warm body to be guarded too, from the evil eye of an envious glance, and from the fairies, who were said to covet a plump human child above all things. And here you meet the red coral, for around the necks and wrists of medieval and Renaissance infants you will find, again and again, little strings and branches of polished red coral, worn as amulets against exactly these dangers. The belief was old even then, reaching back to Rome and beyond. The physicians and the lapidaries alike praised coral, as a guard against the evil eye, against fevers and fits, against the malice of the unseen, and mothers pressed a smooth coral branch into a teething, baby's hand as both charm and comfort. If you have ever wondered why so many painted Madonnas in old altarpieces show the Christ child wearing a bright coral bead at his throat, now you know. The painters were simply dressing the holy infant the way any careful mother would dress her own, in the best protection money could buy. And here's the strange part, the quirky little thread in all this. The luckiest charm of the whole birth chamber could not be bought at any price, because it had to be born with the child. Now and then an infant arrives with a piece of the birth membrane still draped like a delicate veil across its face, and this is called the caul, and to be born with it was reckoned one of the most fortunate signs a person could carry. A child born in the caul was destined for luck, it was said, gifted perhaps with second sight, and above all safe from ever drowning. The membrane was carefully dried and kept, and here is where it turns oddly commercial, because sailors would pay handsomely for one, carrying a stranger's caul aboard as a talisman against a watery grave, and lawyers, oddly enough, prized them too, believing a caul in the pocket gave a silver tongue in court, which tells you something about how medieval folk ranked the perils of the sea against the perils of the courtroom. Advertisements for cauls for sale would still appear in newspapers centuries later, long after most such magic had faded. Historians still argue whether the churching of women that followed the birth was truly a rite of purification, cleansing a mother thought unclean, or simply a warm thanksgiving and a welcome back into her community after the danger had passed. For some weeks after the birth, the mother kept indoors, in a kind of soft seclusion, and did not cross the church threshold. Then, when she was strong again, she came veiled to the church door to be blessed, to give thanks for surviving, and to be led back inside among her neighbours. To the women themselves, by many accounts, it felt less like a shaming and more like a homecoming, a candle, a prayer, a feast waiting after, and the simple relief of being counted safe. And through all these anxious weeks the cradle itself was quietly fortified, for the deepest dread was that the fairies might steal the true infant away and leave a withered, wailing changeling in its place. So into the cradle went the old iron, a nail, a knife, a horseshoe tucked beneath the mattress. And above it, sometimes, a pair of open scissors hung with the blades crossed, for iron and cold steel were the things the fairy folk could not abide. A mother might pin an iron pin to the swaddling, or lay her husband's coat across the crib, and sleep a little easier for it. And you, standing in that warm and watchful room, begin to feel your own eyes grow heavy in the firelight, lulled by the low voices and the small guarded breathing of a child ringed round with coral and iron against the dark. And so, at the very last, the long road we have walked together begins to bend gently toward home, back out of the deep medieval dark and into the quiet of your own familiar room. But not, as it turns out, entirely empty-handed, because you have been carrying pieces of that vanished world with you all along without ever quite noticing their weight. For here is the softest secret of the whole journey, the one worth resting your head upon. None of it truly disappeared. The great cathedral fears thinned out, the plague theories crumbled, the astrologers folded up their charts, the burning of herbs and the reading of comets faded from the record, and yet the smallest superstitions, the household-sized ones, slipped quietly through the centuries and are still living, this very night in the ordinary gestures of ordinary people who have no idea they are doing anything medieval at all. Think of it. When something good is said aloud and someone reaches over to knock upon the nearest table, or touch a door frame, or rap their own knuckles against a chair, they are performing a rite far older than they know, a half-remembered reaching for the living spirit believed to dwell in wood, a quiet plea not to tempt whatever might be listening. When you cross your fingers for luck, you are folding your hand into the shape of a cross, a small secret blessing tucked into a gesture so casual you forget it means anything. When a friend sneezes and you murmur "bless you" without a thought, you're echoing an instinct old enough to have comforted people who believed a sneeze might, just possibly, shake the soul loose for a heartbeat. And here, warmly, is your one true fact for this final night, and it is a real one. The horseshoe hung above a doorway. For luck was so beloved across medieval Europe that it drew together two separate old beliefs at once. The protective power people assigned to iron, which fairies and mischief were said to shun, and the near magical status of the blacksmith, one of the few who could bend hard metal to his will. Two superstitions for the price of one, which is really rather good value. They are everywhere once you start noticing them. The spilled salt tossed over the left shoulder, the left, mind you, never the right, because that was the side the medieval imagination reserved for anything up to no good, and salt was far too precious to lose without a fight. The careful little swerve people still make to avoid walking beneath a leaning ladder, long after anyone remembers that a ladder against a wall once traced a shape thought sacred and not to be broken. And oddly enough, here is the strange part to carry into your dreams, the number 13 is still so quietly unwelcome that to this day a great many hotels simply refuse to admit they have a 13th floor, letting the elevator leap from 12 straight to 14, as though a whole story had politely excused itself, while airlines skip the 13th row entirely, seating you in row 14 above a number that isn't missing so much as tactfully not mentioned. An entire modern industry of steel and glass, tiptoeing around a medieval worry it would never admit to holding. There is something lovely in that, and something a little funny too, because we like to imagine we have grown so very far past all this, that we are creatures of reason now, unbothered by omens, and then we blow out a birthday candle and make a wish and tell absolutely no one, exactly as instructed, by no one, for reasons we could not begin to explain. Historians still argue whether these little habits survive because some faint belief truly clings to them, or simply because they are gentle, pleasant things to do, small rituals that cost nothing and ask nothing and give the hand something kind to perform in an uncertain moment. Perhaps it hardly matters which. The medieval world and your own are not two distant countries after all, but one long room with the far end in shadow, and these small gestures are the threads strung between them, threads of hope and of a soft old unease passed hand to hand down 800, years of firelit evenings until they reached tonight the quiet of yours. So you can lay it all down now, the whole long weight of it. The comets and the candles, the black dogs and the church bells, the sneezes and the salt and the shuttered 13th floors. Let them settle, warm and harmless, into the dark around your bed. The candle beside you is low now, its little flame leaning, growing soft and gold and small. The fire in the hearth has sunk down to a bed of glowing embers, breathing gently, asking nothing more of the night, Somewhere far off the last bell has already rung, and now the bells are quiet, and the whole hushed world has gone still and kind. You are safe. You are warm. There is nothing left tonight to watch for, nothing to ward off, no omen in the sky that means you any harm. The old fears have all been told, and telling them has worn them smooth and gentle, and now they drift away like smoke. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders grow heavy and easy against the pillow. Let the last light dim. The embers glow. The room is still. All is well, and you may sleep. Sweet dreams.